In the depths of the 20th century, while the world tore itself apart through two catastrophic wars, one man sat alone in a stone tower by a Swiss lake, descending into territories of the human mind that no scientist had ever dared to explore. Carl Gustav Jung was not merely a psychiatrist or a theorist of the unconscious. He was an explorer of the soul, a cartographer of inner worlds, a prophet who understood that the greatest crisis facing humanity was not political or economic, but psychological and spiritual. What you're about to hear is the complete architecture of his revolutionary vision, every major insight, every profound discovery, every warning he offered to a civilization that had lost its way. Long before our current epidemic of anxiety and meaninglessness, Jung diagnosed the fundamental disease of modern consciousness. Decades before neuroscience began mapping the brain, he had already mapped the psyche with uncanny precision. Years before the collapse of traditional religious frameworks left millions spiritually homeless, he predicted exactly this crisis and offered a path through it. His psychology was not an academic exercise, but a life raft thrown to drowning souls, a language for experiences that our rational culture had declared impossible or pathological. This is not a simple summary of psychological theories. These ideas emerge from direct confrontation with the darkest and most luminous dimensions of human existence. Jung did not develop his concepts through abstract speculation, but through his own terrifying descent into madness, and his systematic observation of thousands of patients who brought him dreams, visions, and symptoms that conventional medicine could not explain. He witnessed things that should not exist according to materialist science. He encountered forces within the human psyche that seemed to possess intelligence and purpose, independent of conscious will. He discovered that the individual human mind was connected to something vastly larger and older than itself. Jung's journey began with a friendship and ended with a rupture that shaped the entire trajectory of depth psychology. His relationship with Sigmund Freud promised to be one of the great intellectual partnerships in history. The older Freud saw in the younger Jung a brilliant successor who would carry psychoanalysis forward into new territories. But Jung could not accept Freud's reduction of all psychological life to sexuality and repression. He saw deeper patterns, older forces, universal symbols that appeared in the dreams and fantasies of people who had never been exposed to each other's cultures. When he tried to share these discoveries with Freud, the response was dismissive and eventually hostile. The break between them was not merely professional but deeply personal, and it plunged Jung into a crisis that would either destroy him or transform him into something unprecedented. For several years after the rupture with Freud, Jung descended into what he later called his confrontation with the unconscious. He experienced visions and heard voices. He painted strange circular images that seemed to emerge from a source beyond his conscious control. He recorded conversations with inner figures who appeared to have their own personalities and agendas. To any outside observer, he appeared to be having a psychotic break. But Jung maintained a crucial thread of conscious awareness throughout this ordeal. He observed his own inner chaos with the discipline of a scientist studying a natural phenomenon. He refused to identify completely with the overwhelming forces that rose from the depths of his psyche. And gradually, through this methodical engagement with madness, he began to discern patterns and principles that would become the foundation of his entire psychological system. What emerged from this crucible was a vision of the human psyche far more complex and mysterious than anything proposed by academic psychology. Jung discovered that beneath the personal unconscious, described by Freud, lay a deeper stratum he called the collective unconscious, a dimension of mind shared by all human beings regardless of culture or historical period. This collective unconscious contained what he called archetypes, universal patterns and images that shaped human experience across all times and places. These archetypes were not learned but inherited, not cultural but biological, not optional but inescapable. They manifested in myths and religions, in dreams and artistic creations, in political movements and personal relationships. They were the hidden architects of human civilization, and the secret forces behind individual destiny. But Jung's psychology was not merely descriptive. It was profoundly therapeutic and ultimately spiritual. He understood that modern humanity suffered from a peculiar form of illness that conventional medicine could not address. We had become disconnected from the deeper sources of meaning and vitality within our own psyches. We had identified exclusively with our conscious rational minds and declared war on everything that did not fit into that narrow framework. We had built a civilization of unprecedented technological power while becoming psychologically and spiritually impoverished. The result was an epidemic of neurosis, depression, addiction, and what Jung called the loss of soul. The cure for this modern disease could not come from more rationality or better social engineering. It required a fundamental reorientation of consciousness, a reconciliation with the rejected and repressed dimensions of our own nature. Jung called this process individualization, the journey toward wholeness and integration. It was not about becoming more successful or more socially adapted, but about becoming more completely yourself, integrating both light and shadow, both masculine and feminine, both conscious and unconscious aspects of your being. This journey was difficult and dangerous. It required courage to face what you had been avoiding, honesty to acknowledge what you had been denying, and humility to accept guidance from sources beyond your conscious control. The wisdom contained in Jung's work remains as relevant today as when he first articulated it, perhaps even more so. We live in an age of unprecedented material abundance and equally unprecedented spiritual poverty. We have more access to information than any previous generation, but less connection to genuine meaning. We have more individual freedom than ever before, but more confusion about how to use that freedom. We have eliminated many traditional sources of suffering, but created new forms of psychological torment that our ancestors never experienced. Depression, anxiety, addiction, and suicide rates continue to climb, despite all our therapeutic interventions and pharmaceutical solutions. Something fundamental is missing from our understanding of human nature and human needs. Jung offers us a way of understanding this crisis and potentially transcending it. His psychology acknowledges dimensions of reality that our materialist culture denies, but that every human being intuitively recognizes in moments of honesty. It takes seriously experiences that conventional psychology dismisses as mere subjective phenomena, with no objective reality. It treats the soul not as a poetic metaphor, but as a living reality that requires care and cultivation. Most importantly, it offers each individual a path toward wholeness that does not depend on external circumstances or social validation, but on inner work and honest self-confrontation. What you are about to hear is the complete map of this psychological and spiritual journey. We will explore the architecture of archetypes and how they shape human experience. We will descend into the shadow, that dark twin that follows every conscious identity. We will encounter the Anima and Animus, those inner figures of the opposite sex that complicate every romantic relationship. We will examine how dreams communicate messages from regions of the psyche that speak a symbolic rather than literal language. We will investigate synchronicity, those meaningful coincidences that suggest a hidden order beneath apparent chaos. We will trace the process of individualization from its beginning in youthful identification with collective values through the midlife crisis, and on toward the achievement of genuine selfhood. We will also confront Jung's prophetic warnings about the psychological dangers facing modern civilization. He understood decades before it became obvious that the rejection of religious and spiritual dimensions of life would create a vacuum that would be filled by destructive political ideologies and mass psychological movements. He predicted that the repressed shadow of Western civilization would erupt in unprecedented violence and cruelty. He warned that technological progress without psychological development would lead to catastrophe. His predictions have been vindicated by history, and his warnings have become even more urgent as we face new forms of collective madness enabled by digital technology and social media. But Jung's vision was ultimately hopeful rather than pessimistic. He believed that individuals who undertook the difficult work of psychological integration could become agents of transformation for the larger culture. He trusted that the unconscious itself possessed a healing wisdom that would guide those brave enough to listen. He saw evidence in his own life and in the lives of his patients that genuine transformation was possible, that psychological wounds could become sources of insight and strength, that the journey through darkness could lead to unexpected light. His own life demonstrated this possibility. The man who descended into near madness emerged as one of the most creative and influential thinkers of the 20th century, producing a body of work that continues to illuminate the human condition. Prepare yourself for a journey into the depths of human consciousness and beyond. This is not entertainment, but genuine exploration of territories that each of us must eventually enter if we are to become fully human. The insights you encounter here have the power to change how you understand yourself, your relationships, your culture, and your place in the larger order of existence. Some of what you hear will challenge your assumptions and disturb your comfortable certainties. Some will illuminate experiences you have had but could not explain. Some will open possibilities you never imagined. All of it emerges from one man's courageous willingness to explore the darkest and most luminous regions of the human soul and return with a map for those who would follow. The story of Jung's greatest discovery begins with a problem that conventional psychology could not explain. In his early years as a psychiatrist at the Burghölzli Hospital in Zurich, Jung encountered patients whose delusions and hallucinations contained remarkably specific symbols and narratives that appeared nowhere in their personal histories or cultural backgrounds. A schizophrenic patient who had never studied mythology described visions that precisely matched ancient mythic rituals that Jung himself only discovered years later in obscure academic texts. A depressed woman dreamed of symbols that appeared in alchemical manuscripts she could never have encountered. Children reported nightmares featuring archetypal figures that seemed to emerge from sources far older than their brief lives. These observations troubled Jung because they contradicted the fundamental assumption of Freudian psychoanalysis. If the unconscious consisted only of repressed personal memories and experiences, how could it produce images and narratives that the individual had never encountered? Freud's theory suggested that everything in the unconscious had once been conscious, but had been pushed down through repression. But Jung was seeing material that had never been conscious in the individual's lifetime, material that seemed to come from somewhere else entirely, from some deeper stratum of mind that transcended personal history. The tension between Jung and Freud over this issue grew steadily more intense. Freud insisted that all psychological material must ultimately be traceable to personal experience, particularly experiences of childhood sexuality and family dynamics. He treated Jung's observations about universal symbols as a betrayal of psychoanalytic principles, a regression to mysticism and pre-scientific thinking. But Jung could not deny what he was seeing in his clinical work. The evidence was overwhelming that human beings possessed access to a dimension of psyche that was collective rather than individual, inherited rather than acquired, universal rather than culturally specific. The final break with Freud came in 1913, and it plunged Jung into the most dangerous and productive period of his life. Cut off from the psychoanalytic community and questioning everything he thought he knew about the human mind, Jung turned his investigative attention inward. He began deliberately inducing altered states of consciousness through a technique he called active imagination. He would quiet his rational mind and allow images to arise spontaneously from the unconscious. Then he would engage these images as if they were independent beings with their own reality and intelligence. He painted what he saw, wrote down conversations with inner figures, and mapped the geography of inner worlds that seemed as real and complex as the external world of ordinary perception. What Jung discovered through this dangerous experiment was that the unconscious was not a chaotic repository of repressed desires, but an ordered realm with its own inhabitants, its own laws, its own purposes. he encountered archetypal figures who appeared again and again in different forms. An old wise man who offered guidance and perspective. A mysterious woman who embodied qualities Jung had rejected in himself. A shadow figure who represented everything Jung refused to acknowledge about his own nature. A divine child who symbolized new possibilities of consciousness. These figures were not inventions of Jung's personal imagination, but autonomous entities that seemed to emerge from a source beyond his individual psyche. The crucial insight came when Jung realized that these same figures appeared in the dreams and fantasies of his patients, in the myths and religions of cultures around the world, in the fairy tales told to children in every society. The old wise man appeared as Merlin, as the Hebrew prophets, as the guru of Eastern traditions, as the sage who guides the hero in countless stories. The mysterious woman appeared as Sophia, as the Virgin Mary, as the feminine deities of ancient religions, as the muse who inspires artists and poets. The shadow appeared as demons and devils, as the evil twin, as the monster that must be defeated, as the dark double that haunts every hero's journey. These were not arbitrary cultural inventions, but universal patterns that arose from the collective unconscious, that deeper stratum of mind that Jung had discovered. Jung called these universal patterns archetypes, using a term from ancient Greek philosophy. Archetypes were not specific images, but underlying forms or templates that shaped human experience across all times and places. They were like the invisible structures that determine the visible patterns of nature, like the DNA that shapes biological development, like the deep grammar that underlies all human languages. You could never encounter an archetype directly, only through its manifestations in specific images, narratives, and experiences, but the archetype itself remained constant beneath all its varied expressions. The collective unconscious that contained these archetypes was not a place but a dimension of mind, a stratum that existed beneath personal consciousness and personal unconscious. Every individual mind was like an island rising from a vast ocean. The visible part of the island represented consciousness, the awareness of self and world that characterizes waking life. Just below the surface lay the personal unconscious, the realm of forgotten memories and repressed experiences that Freud had explored. But deeper still lay the collective unconscious, the shared ocean from which all individual minds emerged and to which all remained connected. This ocean was not composed of water, but of archetypal patterns and images that shaped human psychology across all cultures and historical periods. This discovery revolutionized psychology, but it also raised profound questions about the nature of mind and reality. If the collective unconscious existed, it meant that individual consciousness was far less autonomous than modern culture assumed. We were not isolated rational agents creating meaning through our own choices and interpretations. We were participants in larger patterns that shaped our perceptions, our emotions, our relationships, our spiritual experiences. The archetypes were not neutral templates, but powerful forces that could possess consciousness, flooding the ego with energies and images that overwhelmed rational control. Understanding these forces was essential for psychological health, but that understanding could never be purely intellectual. It required direct encounter with the archetypal realm through dreams, through active imagination, through the symbolic life of ritual and art. Jung recognized that his discovery of the collective unconscious explained phenomena that conventional psychology dismissed as pathological or meaningless. Religious experiences were not mere projections or wish fulfillments, but encounters with archetypal realities that existed in the collective unconscious. Mystical visions were not hallucinations, but perceptions of inner realities that were as real as external objects. Myths were not primitive attempts at scientific explanation, but symbolic expressions of psychological truths that could not be captured in literal language. Art was not merely decorative or entertaining, but a vehicle for bringing archetypal content into consciousness, where it could be integrated and transformed. But Jung also understood that modern civilization had lost its connection to the collective unconscious and the archetypal dimension of existence. The Enlightenment emphasis on reason and empirical observation had declared war on everything that could not be measured or controlled. Religion had been reduced to superstition, myth, to primitive error, visionary experience to pathology. The result was a culture that was psychologically starved, cut off from the deeper sources of meaning and vitality. Modern people suffered not from too much instinct, but from too little contact with the instinctual and archetypal foundations of life. They had become hyperconscious but spiritually empty, sophisticated in thought, but impoverished in soul. The collective unconscious explained not only individual psychology but collective phenomena that conventional theories could not address. Mass political movements that swept millions of people into irrational behaviours were not simply results of propaganda or economic conditions, but eruptions of archetypal forces that possessed collective consciousness. The appeal of totalitarian leaders reflected archetypal patterns of the divine king or the saviour figure. The persecution of scapegoats reflected the projection of the collective shadow onto vulnerable groups. The cycles of war and peace, revolution and reaction, followed archetypal patterns that repeated throughout history because they emerged from the timeless realm of the collective unconscious. Jung spent the rest of his life exploring the collective unconscious and mapping its archetypal inhabitants. He studied alchemy and discovered that medieval alchemists were not failed chemists, but sophisticated psychologists who used the symbolism of chemical transformation to describe the process of psychological transformation. He investigated world religions and found that they all dealt with the same archetypal realities using different symbolic languages. He analysed thousands of dreams and discovered that the unconscious possessed its own intelligence, its own purposes, its own ways of communicating through symbol and metaphor. He developed therapeutic techniques that helped individuals establish a relationship with their unconscious, rather than remaining ignorant of its existence or fighting against its manifestations. The discovery of the collective unconscious was not merely a theoretical achievement, but a practical tool for psychological healing and spiritual development. By understanding that consciousness emerged from and remained connected to deeper archetypal layers of psyche, individuals could stop feeling so isolated and alienated. By recognizing archetypal patterns in their own dreams and experiences, they could gain perspective on personal problems and see them as expressions of universal human struggles. By learning to engage the archetypal dimension through active imagination and symbolic thinking, they could access sources of creativity and wisdom that were foreclosed by purely rational approaches to life. The collective unconscious was not something to fear, but something to explore, not an enemy of consciousness, but its foundation and its ultimate resource for renewal and transformation. If the collective unconscious was the ocean from which all minds emerged, the archetypes were its most powerful currents and its deepest structures. Jung spent decades studying these universal patterns, identifying their characteristics, mapping their relationships, tracing their manifestations across cultures and throughout history. What emerged from this research was a systematic understanding of the psyche's fundamental architecture, a topology of the soul that revealed how human beings were constructed at the deepest levels of their being. The archetypes were not merely interesting psychological phenomena, but the organizing principles of consciousness itself. They shaped perception, structured emotion, determined the patterns of human relationships, and guided the trajectory of individual development from birth through death. Understanding the archetypes was not optional for anyone seeking psychological health or spiritual development. These forces operated whether you acknowledged them or not, and ignorance of their existence only increased their power to control your life unconsciously. Jung identified several primary archetypes that appeared consistently across different cultures and historical periods. Each archetype represented a fundamental aspect of human experience, a universal pattern that every individual encountered in some form during their psychological development. These were not abstractions, but living realities that could be experienced directly through dreams, through powerful emotions, through encounters with art and myth, through moments when ordinary consciousness gave way to something larger and more primordial. The shadow was perhaps the most important archetype for psychological health and the most difficult to integrate into consciousness. The shadow contained everything about yourself that you refused to acknowledge, everything that contradicted your self-image and your ideals. It was composed of qualities and impulses that you had repressed because they seemed incompatible with being a good person, a successful professional, a loving parent, or whatever role you identified with most strongly. The shadow was not intrinsically evil, though it often appeared that way because it contained rejected and unexamined material that expressed itself in distorted and destructive ways when it remained unconscious. Every individual had a personal shadow, but there was also a collective shadow that belonged to entire cultures and civilizations. The personal shadow contained your own rejected qualities and impulses. The collective shadow contained everything that a culture refused to acknowledge about itself, all the violence and greed and irrationality that contradicted its ideals and self-image. When individuals projected their personal shadows onto others, they saw in other people the qualities they denied in themselves. When cultures projected their collective shadow, they created enemies and scapegoats who supposedly embodied all the evil that the culture itself refused to acknowledge. The Anima and Animus represented the contrasexual elements within each individual psyche. The Anima was the feminine aspect of the male psyche, the inner woman who mediated between consciousness and the unconscious. The Animus was the masculine aspect of the female psyche, the inner man who performed a similar mediating function. These archetypes were not social constructs or learned gender roles, but deep structures of psyche that existed regardless of cultural conditioning. They manifested in dreams as figures of the opposite sex, in projections onto romantic partners, in the way individuals related to their own unconscious. Jung discovered that the Anima and Animes developed through distinct stages, moving from primitive and instinctual forms toward more refined and spiritual manifestations. A man's Anima might first appear as a seductive and dangerous woman, representing his most basic emotional and instinctual nature. Through psychological development, she could evolve into a figure of wisdom and spiritual guidance. A woman's animus might first manifest as a primitive and aggressive male figure, representing undeveloped masculine qualities of assertion and judgment. Through development, he could evolve into a figure of spiritual authority and creative inspiration. The self was the archetype of wholeness and totality, the organizing principle that directed the entire process of psychological development. Unlike the ego, which was the center of consciousness, the self was the center of the entire psyche, encompassing both consciousness and unconsciousness, both personal and collective dimensions of mind. The self was paradoxically both the goal of development and its origin, both what you were trying to become and what you had always been beneath the layers of conditioning and identification with partial aspects of your nature. The self manifested in symbols of wholeness and completeness. The circle or mandala was its most universal symbol, appearing in the sacred art of cultures around the world. The quaternity or fourfold pattern represented the self's attempt to bring balance and integration to the four major functions of consciousness. The divine child symbolized the self as unrealized potential, the seed of future development. The wise old man or woman represented the self as achieved wisdom and integration, but the self could never be fully comprehended by consciousness because it transcended the ego's capacity for understanding. The Great Mother was an archetype that appeared in both positive and negative forms, representing the nourishing and devouring aspects of nature and the unconscious. In her positive manifestation, she was the source of life, comfort, and protection, the goddess who provided for her children and sustained them in times of need. In her negative manifestation, she was the witch or the dragon, the devouring force that smothered independence and consumed those who remained too long in her embrace. Every individual's relationship with their actual mother was coloured by projections of this archetype, and psychological development required differentiating between the archetypal mother and the real human woman who gave birth to you. The wise old man appeared as the archetype of meaning and knowledge, the guide who possessed understanding that transcended personal experience. He manifested in figures like Merlin, like the Hebrew prophets, like the spiritual teacher or mentor who appeared at crucial moments to offer guidance. This archetype could also appear in negative forms as the rigid authority who imposed his judgments without wisdom, as the cruel father who demanded obedience without understanding, as the senex who represented stagnation rather than genuine wisdom. The hero represented the ego's struggle to establish itself against the overwhelming forces of the unconscious and the demands of collective adaptation. Every hero's journey involved leaving home, facing trials and dangers, confronting monsters or dragons, achieving a goal or finding a treasure, and returning transformed. This universal pattern appeared in myths from every culture because it reflected the psychological necessity of separating from parental and collective influences to achieve individual identity. But Jung recognized that the hero's journey was only the first half of life's psychological development. The second half required a different task. Not heroic achievement, but humble acceptance. Not conquest, but integration. Not separation, but reconciliation. The trickster was the archetype of chaos and creativity, the force that disrupted established order and created space for new possibilities. The trickster appeared as Loki in Norse mythology, as Coyote in Native American stories, as Hermes in Greek tradition, as the fool or joker in countless tales. This archetype represented the unconscious's resistance to rigid conscious attitudes, the psyche's need for play and spontaneity, the creative potential that emerged when established patterns broke down. The trickster could be destructive and immoral, but this destruction often cleared the way for necessary transformation. Jung understood that these archetypes did not exist in isolation, but formed a complex system of relationships and tensions. The ego's relationship with the shadow determined whether rejected aspects of personality would be integrated or projected. The development of Anima or Animus determined the quality of relationships with actual members of the opposite sex. The constellation of the self initiated the process of individualization and guided its unfolding through dreams and synchronistic events. The appearance of the Great Mother or Wise Old Man in dreams signaled particular phases of development and particular challenges that needed to be addressed. But Jung also recognized the danger of becoming possessed by archetypes, of identifying consciousness with archetypal energies and losing the crucial distinction between ego and archetype. When someone identified with the hero archetype, they became inflated with a sense of their own importance and mission. When someone identified with the wise old man, they became rigid and authoritarian. When someone identified with the Great Mother, they became smothering and possessive. The goal was not identification with archetypes, but relationship with them, recognizing their power and autonomy while maintaining the integrity of conscious perspective. The study of archetypes was not merely academic but intensely practical. By learning to recognize archetypal patterns in dreams, in relationships, in cultural phenomena, individuals could gain perspective on their own psychological processes and the larger forces shaping their lives. By understanding that these patterns were universal rather than personal, they could avoid the trap of believing their problems were unique and unsolvable. By engaging archetypes through active imagination and symbolic work, They could access energies and insights that remained unavailable to purely rational consciousness. The archetypes were the alphabet of the soul's language, and learning to read that language was essential for anyone seeking to live consciously and fully. There is a figure that follows you everywhere you go, that appears in your dreams wearing faces you barely recognize, that emerges in moments of stress or intoxication when your conscious control weakens. This figure contains everything you have declared unacceptable about yourself, everything that contradicts the story you tell about who you are. Jung called it the shadow, and he understood that until you confronted this dark twin and integrated its rejected contents, you could never become whole or fully conscious. The shadow was not optional, not something possessed only by evil people or psychological failures. Every human being had a shadow, and the more virtuous and righteous someone appeared, the darker and more dangerous their shadow was likely to be. The formation of the shadow begins in childhood, when you first learn that certain behaviors and qualities are praised, while others are punished or ignored. A child who discovers that aggression is unacceptable learns to repress angry impulses, pushing them into the unconscious where they form the beginning of the shadow. A child who learns that vulnerability is weakness learns to hide their need for comfort and care, adding those qualities to the shadow. A child who is rewarded for being smart learns to repress impulses toward playfulness and spontaneity. Layer by layer, the shadow grows throughout childhood and adolescence as you construct an identity that is acceptable to parents, teachers, peers, and eventually to yourself. But what is repressed does not disappear. The shadow continues to live in the unconscious, and it gains power precisely because it is not acknowledged. The angry impulses that were forbidden in childhood do not vanish, but express themselves in passive aggression, in cutting remarks disguised as jokes, in sudden explosions of rage that seem to come from nowhere. The vulnerable feelings that were declared unacceptable do not disappear, but create secret neediness that undermines relationships. The playfulness that was suppressed does not vanish, but returns in compulsive behaviors and addictions that provide the spontaneity that conscious life lacks. Jung discovered that the shadow often appeared in dreams as a figure of the same sex as the dreamer, someone who embodied qualities the dreamer consciously rejected. For a man who prided himself on his rationality and self-control, the shadow might appear as a wild and instinctual man, perhaps a criminal or a primitive savage. For a woman who identified strongly with nurturing and care, the shadow might appear as a cruel and selfish woman who cared nothing for others. These dream figures were not representations of other people, but aspects of the dreamer's own psyche that had been split off and exiled to the unconscious. The most dangerous aspect of the shadow was not its existence, but its projection onto other people and groups. When you saw in others the qualities you denied in yourself, you could attack and condemn those qualities without recognizing them as your own. A person who repressed their own aggression became obsessed with the violence of others and saw threats everywhere. A person who denied their own sexuality became fixated on the sexual improprieties of others. A person who refused to acknowledge their own prejudice or prejudice everywhere else, while remaining blind to their own. Projection was the primary mechanism through which the shadow remained unconscious, while still exercising powerful influence over conscious life. Jung understood that projection operated not only at the individual level, but at the collective level as well. Entire nations and cultures developed collective shadows, composed of qualities and impulses that contradicted their collective self-image. Western civilization, which prided itself on rationality and progress, developed a shadow that contained irrationality and primitivism. This shadow was projected onto other cultures, particularly indigenous peoples and non-Western civilizations, who were seen as primitive and irrational precisely because they embodied what the West had repressed in itself. The violent colonization and exploitation of these peoples was justified through projection of the Western shadow onto its victims. The history of the 20th century demonstrated with horrifying clarity what happened when the collective shadow erupted into consciousness. Nazi Germany represented the return of everything that modern European civilization had declared itself to have transcended: tribalism, irrationality, barbaric violence, worship of power. But Jung recognized that these qualities had never been transcended but only repressed, and their return was all the more destructive because they had been denied for so long. The concentration camps and mass murder were not aberrations, but the shadow of Enlightenment civilization expressing itself with industrial efficiency and technological sophistication. But Jung's understanding of the shadow was not primarily moral but psychological. The shadow was not evil in itself but became dangerous when it remained unconscious, and was therefore unable to be integrated and transformed. The qualities contained in the shadow often included not only negative traits, but positive ones that had been repressed because they did not fit the chosen identity. An intellectual might have repressed emotional and intuitive capacities that ended up in the shadow. A rational person might have repressed imagination and fantasy. A serious person might have repressed playfulness and humour. Integrating the shadow meant recovering these lost aspects of personality, not only confronting what was dark, but reclaiming what was valuable. The process of shadow integration was difficult and often painful, because it required acknowledging aspects of yourself that you had spent your entire life denying. It meant recognizing that you were capable of the very behaviors and attitudes that you condemned most harshly in others. It meant admitting that your conscious ideals and self-image were partial and one-sided, that you had constructed your identity through exclusion and repression rather than genuine wholeness. This recognition was humiliating to the ego, which preferred to maintain its illusory purity rather than acknowledge its shadow. Jung developed techniques for working with the shadow that went beyond mere intellectual recognition. Active imagination allowed individuals to engage the shadow as if it were an autonomous being with its own perspective and reality. In this process, you might imagine meeting your shadow figure and asking what it wanted, why it behaved as it did, what it represented that your conscious identity lacked. The answers that emerged were often surprising and challenging, revealing that qualities you had judged as purely negative served important psychological functions when properly integrated. Dreams provided another crucial avenue for shadow work. When shadow figures appeared in dreams, they demanded attention and response. Ignoring them or dismissing them as mere representations of bad people only strengthened their unconscious power. But engaging them seriously, trying to understand what they represented, asking what message they brought from the unconscious, could begin the process of integration. Often the shadow figure in a dream was trying to compensate for one-sided conscious attitudes, bringing qualities that were needed for psychological balance, even though they contradicted the ego's preferred self-image. Jung discovered that the shadow could also manifest in what he called possession, when unconscious contents overwhelmed consciousness and took control of behavior. Someone might suddenly act in ways that were completely unlike their normal personality, as if a different person had taken over. These episodes were not random, but represented the eruption of shadow material that had been repressed too long and too completely. The person who never allowed themselves to feel anger might suddenly explode in violent rage. The person who prided themselves on honesty might suddenly find themselves lying compulsively. These possessions were the shadow's way of forcing recognition, of insisting on being acknowledged and integrated. But shadow integration was not a single event, but a lifelong process. Each stage of life brought new challenges and new aspects of personality that needed to be integrated. Material that seemed successfully integrated at one stage might need to be revisited and worked with again at a later stage. The shadow was not a fixed entity, but a dynamic process, constantly changing as consciousness developed and as life circumstances changed. The goal was not to eliminate the shadow, but to maintain an ongoing relationship with it, to keep the dialogue between consciousness, and unconscious active and productive. Jung recognized that authentic morality could only emerge from shadow integration. Someone who had not confronted their own capacity for evil could not make genuine moral choices because they did not understand what they were choosing between. They could only follow rules or conform to social expectations, while their unconscious shadow contaminated their supposedly virtuous actions with projection, self-righteousness, and hidden cruelty. But someone who had faced their own darkness could make real moral decisions based on genuine understanding of human nature and genuine compassion for others who struggled with the same temptations and failures. The integration of the shadow was also essential for psychological energy and vitality. When large portions of personality were locked in the unconscious, the energy associated with those qualities was unavailable for conscious use. People became exhausted and depleted because so much of their psychic energy was being used to maintain repression rather than being available for creative and productive activities. As the shadow was integrated, this energy became available again, often leading to dramatic increases in vitality and creative capacity. The very qualities that had seemed so dangerous when unconscious became sources of strength and effectiveness when consciously integrated. The shadow represented perhaps the most difficult challenge in Jung's psychology, because it required genuine humility and honest self-examination. It was far easier to project one's darkness onto others and remain convinced of one's own righteousness. It was more comfortable to maintain a clean and virtuous self-image, even if that image was achieved through massive repression and self-deception. But Jung insisted that this path led inevitably to psychological illness, moral blindness, and eventually to the eruption of unconscious contents in destructive and often catastrophic ways. The only real path to psychological health and genuine morality was through the dark valley of shadow recognition and integration, acknowledging what you had spent your life denying and embracing what you had tried so hard to reject. Within every man lives a woman. Within every woman lives a man. This was not metaphor or poetry, but Jung's discovery of actual psychological structures that existed in the unconscious, regardless of conscious gender identity or social conditioning. He called the feminine element in the male psyche the Anima, and the masculine element in the female psyche the Animus. These contra-sexual archetypes played crucial roles in psychological development, in the quality of relationships, in creativity and spiritual life. But they also created confusion and conflict when they remained unconscious and were projected onto actual people of the opposite sex. Jung first encountered the Anima through his own psychological crisis after the break with Freud. During his descent into the unconscious, he experienced inner dialogues with a female figure who seemed to possess her own intelligence and perspective. She spoke to him in ways that contradicted his conscious attitudes, offering insights that his rational mind had not produced. At first, Jung thought he was experiencing a psychotic symptom, a hallucination that indicated mental illness. But gradually he recognized that this figure represented an aspect of his own psyche that had remained unconscious, a feminine element that complemented and compensated his consciously masculine identification. The Anima was not simply the sum of a man's experiences with women or his learned attitudes about femininity. She was an archetype, a universal pattern that existed in the collective unconscious and manifested in every man's psyche, regardless of his personal history. The Anima mediated between consciousness and the unconscious, serving as a guide to the inner world and as a source of inspiration and emotional depth. When a man was out of touch with his Anima, he became rigid, overly rational, cut off from his own feelings and from the deeper sources of creativity and meaning. Jung identified 4 stages in the development of the Anima, each representing a more mature and spiritual relationship to the feminine within. The first stage was Eve, the purely biological and instinctual woman who represented fertility and reproduction. At this stage, a man's relationship to the feminine was purely physical and possessive. The second stage was Helen, the woman as romantic ideal and object of desire. At this stage, the feminine became individualized but remained primarily an object of projection and fantasy. The third stage was Mary, the woman as spiritual guide and source of meaning. At this stage, the feminine transcended purely personal relationships and became connected to larger spiritual and ethical dimensions. The fourth stage was Sophia, the woman as wisdom itself, the feminine as the highest spiritual principle. At this final stage, the Anima functioned as a direct connection to the self and to transcendent reality. But the Anima could also manifest in negative forms when she was denied or when the relationship with her became distorted. The negative Anima appeared as the femme fatale who lured men to destruction, as the witch who poisoned relationships, as the moody and irrational force that undermined rational consciousness. Men who had poor relationships with their own anima often found themselves at the mercy of emotional storms they could not understand or control. They might become moody and irritable for no apparent reason, victim to feelings that seem to come from nowhere, and dominate consciousness despite their irrationality. The Animus functioned similarly in women's psychology, but with important differences that reflected the different challenges women faced in psychological development. The Animus represented the masculine principle of logos, of ordering consciousness, of judgment and discrimination. When a woman was out of touch with her Animus, she might lack the capacity to set boundaries, to think critically, to stand up for her own convictions. She might be overwhelmed by feelings and unable to gain the perspective that came from masculine consciousness. Like the Anima, the Animus developed through stages. The first stage was the man of physical power, the athlete or labourer who represented raw masculine energy. The second stage was the man of action and romance, the hero or adventurer who pursued goals and achievements. The third stage was the man of words and ideas, the professor or spokesman who articulated principles and beliefs. The fourth stage was the man of spiritual meaning, the priest or sage who mediated between the human and divine realms. The negative Animus manifested as rigid opinions and judgments that were not based on genuine thinking, but on collective attitudes and unexamined assumptions. Women possessed by the negative Animus might speak with absolute certainty about matters they had not really thought through, repeating cultural clichés and conventional wisdom as if these were their own hard-won insights. The negative Animus could also appear as a critical inner voice that constantly judged and devalued, that told a woman she was inadequate or worthless, that undermined her confidence and authentic self-expression. Jung discovered that the Anima and Animus were primarily responsible for falling in love and for the particular intensity and irrationality that characterized romantic passion. When you fell in love, you were not primarily responding to the actual person, but to your own anima or animus projected onto that person. The beloved seemed to possess magical qualities, to be the embodiment of everything you had been seeking, to promise completion and wholeness. But these qualities belonged to your own unconscious, not to the actual human being onto whom you had projected them. This explained why romantic love was always somewhat blind, and why it often led to disappointment and disillusionment. As the relationship developed and you came to know the actual person rather than your projection, the magical qualities faded. The person who had seemed perfect revealed ordinary human limitations and flaws. The disappointment that followed was inevitable, because no real person could ever match the idealized projection of anima or animus. Many relationships ended at this point, with one or both partners feeling betrayed or deceived. But this disillusionment was actually a necessary stage in psychological development. Jung argued that successful relationships required withdrawing anima or animus projections and relating to the actual person rather than to one's own unconscious. This was difficult work because it required giving up the magical intensity of early romantic love and accepting the more modest satisfactions of a relationship between two real human beings with limitations and flaws. But it was only through this process that genuine intimacy became possible, intimacy based on mutual recognition rather than projection and fantasy. The withdrawal of projections also created an opportunity to develop a direct relationship with one's own anima or animus. Instead of seeking the feminine or masculine qualities you lacked in a partner, you could develop them within yourself through inner work. A man could develop his own capacity for feeling, intuition, and connection to the unconscious without depending on a woman to provide these things. A woman could develop her own capacity for clear thinking, judgment, and assertiveness without depending on a man to supply these qualities. This inner development did not eliminate the need for relationships, but changed their nature from dependency to genuine partnership. Jung also recognized that the Anima and Animus functioned as psychopomps, guides to the underworld of the unconscious. When you followed the Anima or Animus into the depth of psyche, they led you to encounter other archetypal figures and contents that needed to be integrated. They served as mediators between the ego and the self, helping consciousness navigate the dangerous territories of the unconscious without being overwhelmed or lost. But this guiding function only worked when you recognized the Anima or Animus as inner figures, rather than confusing them with actual people in your external life. The creative process was deeply connected to the Anima and Animus. Artists, writers, musicians, and other creative individuals often had particularly active and powerful relationships with these contrasexual figures. The muse who inspired the artist was often an Anima figure, bringing images and insights from the unconscious into consciousness where they could be given form and expression. But the relationship with the muse could be dangerous if the artist became possessed by the Anima and lost touch with reality, or if he tried to find the muse in actual women and destroyed his relationships through impossible demands and projections. Jung understood that modern culture made healthy development of Anima and Animus more difficult because gender roles had become rigid and conventional. Men were taught to repress all feminine qualities and to view emotion and intuition as weakness. Women were taught to repress all masculine qualities and to view assertiveness and independent judgment as unfeminine. These cultural demands increased the unconsciousness of Anima and Animus and strengthened their tendency to manifest through projection rather than inner development. The result was men who were cut off from their own emotional lives and women who were unable to think for themselves, both genders incomplete and seeking in the other what they had repressed in themselves. But Jung also recognized that the rigid gender polarization of his era was beginning to break down, and he saw both opportunities and dangers in this development. The opportunity was for both men and women to develop more complete personalities, integrating both feminine and masculine qualities instead of identifying exclusively with one gender pole. The danger was that people might reject their primary gender identity entirely and create new forms of one-sidedness that would be equally problematic. The goal was not androgyny or the elimination of gender differences, but the integration of contrasexual elements while maintaining a firm grounding in one's primary identity. The relationship with Anima or Animus was a lifelong journey that passed through many stages and transformations. Early in life, these figures might be relatively primitive and instinctual. Through psychological development and inner work, they could evolve into more refined and spiritual forms. But this evolution required conscious engagement, willingness to recognize projections and withdraw them, courage to face the ways these inner figures compensated for one-sided conscious attitudes. The reward for this work was not only better relationships with actual people, but access to deeper sources of creativity, wisdom, and spiritual understanding that could only come through the integration of the inner opposites. At the center of Jung's psychology stands a concept that gives meaning and direction to all psychological development. He called it individuation, and he understood it as the fundamental task of human life, particularly in the second half of life. Individuation was not self-improvement or the achievement of social success. It was not about becoming special or superior to others. It was the process of becoming who you actually were beneath all the layers of social conditioning and unconscious identification. It was the journey toward wholeness, toward the integration of consciousness and unconscious, toward the realization of the self. Jung distinguished carefully between individuation and individualism. Individualism was the ego's assertion of its separate existence against others, the insistence on personal desires and preferences without regard for larger contexts or collective needs. Individuation was something entirely different, a process that actually diminished the ego's dominance by revealing it as only one aspect of a much larger psychic totality. The individuated person did not become more self-centered, but less so because they recognized that the ego was not the whole of personality, but a relatively small part of it. The process of individuation typically began in midlife, though its seeds were present throughout development. The first half of life was necessarily devoted to ego development, to the establishment of a stable identity, to adaptation to social and professional demands. Young people needed to develop a strong ego that could function effectively in the world. They needed to separate from parental influence, establish intimate relationships, develop competence in work, create families if they chose. This was the heroic phase of development, and it required a certain one-sidedness and conscious determination that would become problematic in the second half of life. But somewhere around midlife, often triggered by a crisis or by the simple accumulation of life experience, a new developmental movement began. The adaptations that had worked so well in the first half of life started to feel hollow and unsatisfying. The persona that had been constructed to meet social demands began to feel like a prison. The values and goals that had seemed so important in youth lost their compelling quality. This midlife crisis, as it came to be called, was not pathology, but the beginning of individuation. The psyche's announcement that a new phase of development was necessary. Jung understood that this crisis often manifested as depression or anxiety that seemed to have no obvious external cause. A person might have achieved everything they set out to achieve: success in career, stability in relationships, financial security, and yet feel profoundly dissatisfied and empty. Conventional approaches to this problem, trying to achieve more success or finding new external goals, only made things worse because the crisis was not about external circumstances but about the need for inner transformation. The individualization process required a fundamental shift in the orientation of consciousness. Instead of looking outward for meaning and validation, consciousness had to turn inward and explore the depths of the psyche. Instead of identifying exclusively with the ego and its conscious goals, awareness had to expand to include unconscious contents that had been ignored or repressed. Instead of maintaining rigid persona and pushing everything that contradicted it into the shadow, psychological work required integrating what had been rejected and finding a more comprehensive basis for identity. This inward turn was difficult and often frightening because it meant confronting all the material that had been excluded from consciousness. The shadow had to be acknowledged and integrated. The anima or animus had to be recognized as inner figures rather than projections onto others. The demands of the self had to be heard even when they contradicted ego preferences and ambitions. This process felt like a kind of death, a dissolution of the identity that had been carefully constructed over decades. And in a sense it was a death, the death of the ego's pretension to be the whole of personality. Jung discovered that the individualization process followed certain typical patterns that appeared in the dreams and fantasies of those undergoing it. There was often a descent into darkness, a confrontation with threatening figures and situations that symbolized unconscious contents demanding recognition. There was often a dismemberment or dissolution, images of being torn apart or losing form, which represented the breakdown of rigid ego structures. There was often a period of chaos and confusion when old patterns had broken down but new patterns had not yet emerged. And eventually, if the process was successful, there were images of new birth or transformation, symbols of wholeness like the mandala or the divine child. But Jung emphasized that individuation was not a smooth or linear process. There were advances and retreats, periods of insight and periods of renewed unconsciousness. The same issues had to be worked through again and again at deeper levels. What seemed to be integrated at one stage might prove to have been only partially understood and might need to be revisited with greater awareness. The process was more like a spiral than a straight line, circling back through the same territories but at different altitudes of understanding. The goal of individuation was what Jung called the self, but this was a paradoxical goal because the self was both the origin and the destination of the journey. The self was what you had always been beneath your identifications and conditioning, and it was also what you were trying to become through conscious development. It was the ordering center of the entire psyche, the archetype of wholeness that directed development from within, even when the ego was unaware of its guidance. Individuation was really the process of becoming conscious of the self and aligning ego consciousness with the self's purposes rather than fighting against them. Jung recognized that genuine individuation was rare and difficult. Most people never undertook it because they remained identified with persona and collective values throughout their lives. They achieved what society defined as success, but never discovered their own unique nature and potential. Others began the process but could not sustain it, retreating back into conventional adaptation when the inner work became too difficult or threatening. Only a relatively small number completed enough of the journey to achieve genuine individuality and psychological wholeness. But Jung also insisted that individuation was not an elitist pursuit reserved for the especially gifted or educated. It was a universal human possibility, and in some sense a universal human obligation. Every person had a unique nature that deserved to be realized, gifts that needed to be developed, a path that was theirs alone. Failing to pursue individualization did not mean simply missing an opportunity for personal fulfillment. It meant remaining unconscious and therefore vulnerable to possession by unconscious forces, remaining one-sided and therefore unable to adapt to life's inevitable changes, remaining incomplete and therefore unable to face death with acceptance and peace. The relationship between individuation and collective life was complex and paradoxical. On one hand, individuation required separation from collective norms and values, the courage to be different and to follow an inner path that others might not understand or support. On the other hand, genuine individuation actually served the collective because individuated people contributed something unique that only they could offer. They did not simply conform or rebel, but brought forth new possibilities that enriched collective life. Jung believed that the evolution of consciousness in humanity depended on individuals who were willing to undertake the difficult work of individuation. Jung also recognized that individuation had a spiritual dimension that could not be reduced to purely psychological terms. The encounter with the self was very much like what religious traditions called the encounter with God. The symbols of wholeness that appeared in dreams and active imagination were the same symbols that appeared in religious art and mystical literature. The transformation of consciousness that individuation required was analogous to what religious traditions called conversion or enlightenment. Jung was careful not to make metaphysical claims about whether the self was identical with God or was simply a psychological projection. But he insisted that the experience of the self was numinous, that it possessed the quality of the holy, and that it could not be adequately described in purely secular psychological language. This spiritual dimension of individuation meant that Jung's psychology offered an alternative to both conventional religion and secular materialism. For those who could no longer accept traditional religious beliefs but still felt the need for transcendent meaning, individuation provided a path that honored spiritual experience without requiring belief in doctrines that seemed incompatible with modern knowledge. For those who had embraced materialist worldviews but found them psychologically and spiritually unsatisfying, individuation revealed dimensions of reality that materialism denied but that direct experience confirmed. The process of individuation also changed one's relationship to suffering and death. Someone identified exclusively with ego consciousness experienced suffering as purely negative and death as absolute ending. But someone who had begun to identify with the self experienced suffering as potentially transformative and death as a transition rather than annihilation. This did not eliminate pain or fear, but changed their meaning and reduced their power to overwhelm consciousness. The individuated person could face life's inevitable losses and limitations with greater equanimity because they recognized that ego consciousness was not the whole of their being. Jung spent the last decades of his life working with people in the second half of life who were struggling with questions of meaning and mortality. He discovered that those who had undertaken genuine individuation work faced aging and death very differently from those who remained identified with youthful ego consciousness. They did not cling desperately to diminishing physical powers or deny the reality of their approaching end. Instead, they often experienced a deepening of life's meaning and a sense of completion that prepared them for the final transition. Their dreams frequently contained symbols of the self and images of wholeness that suggested the psyche's natural preparation for death as the ultimate individuation. Every morning you put on a face that is not quite your real face. You adopt attitudes and behaviours that correspond to your social roles, rather than to your authentic feelings and impulses. You speak in ways calculated to produce certain effects, rather than expressing what you actually think. This is not hypocrisy or deception, but psychological necessity. Jung called this adaptive face the persona, and he understood that it was essential for social functioning, even though it could become a prison that trapped consciousness and prevented genuine self-knowledge. The word persona came from ancient theatre, where it referred to the masks that actors wore to indicate which character they were playing. Jung saw that everyone wore such masks in social life, presenting different versions of themselves depending on context and audience. You had a professional persona that you wore at work, a family persona for interactions with relatives, a social persona for casual acquaintances, perhaps even different personas for different groups of friends. These masks were not false selves, but functional adaptations that allowed you to navigate complex social situations without constant conflict or misunderstanding. The development of persona began in childhood, when you first learned that certain behaviours were rewarded while others were punished or ignored. A child quickly discovered which aspects of their nature were acceptable to parents and teachers, and which needed to be hidden or suppressed. The acceptable qualities became incorporated into the developing persona, while the unacceptable ones were pushed into the shadow. This process was necessary for socialization, for learning to live with others and to function in organized society. Without some capacity to adapt and conform, social life would be impossible. But Jung recognized that persona development could go wrong in two opposite ways. Some people never developed an adequate persona and remained socially maladapted, unable to function effectively in conventional settings. They might be authentically themselves, but they paid a heavy price in social isolation and professional failure. Other people became over-identified with their personas and lost touch with everything in themselves that did not fit the social mask. They became their roles so completely that they no longer knew who they were beneath the performance. This over-identification with persona was the more common problem, especially in modern society, where social roles were so elaborately defined and where identity was so often tied to professional achievement and status. Someone might become so identified with being a doctor, a lawyer, a professor, a mother, or a CEO that they could not imagine themselves apart from that role. Their entire sense of self-worth depended on maintaining the persona and playing the role successfully. When circumstances forced them to give up the role through retirement, job loss, or life changes, they experienced devastating identity crises because they had no sense of who they were beneath the mask. Jung discovered that midlife crises were often triggered by the breakdown of persona identifications. A person, might have spent decades building a successful professional identity only to wake up one day and realize that the role felt empty and meaningless. The persona that had seemed so important suddenly appeared as nothing more than a mask, a social performance that had little connection to authentic desires and values. This realization was terrifying because it suggested that years or decades of life had been wasted living someone else's expectations rather than discovering one's own nature. The persona also created problems in intimate relationships, because intimacy required dropping the mask and allowing another person to see what lay beneath. But someone heavily identified with persona could not do this. They remained in role even with spouse or children, performing expected behaviors rather than revealing genuine feelings and vulnerabilities. Their relationships remained superficial because no one ever encountered the real person behind the social adaptation. Partners and children might live for years with someone without ever knowing who they really were. Jung understood that the persona was connected to collective consciousness, to the shared values and expectations of one's culture and social group. The persona represented collective attitudes that the individual had internalized and adopted as their own. This meant that someone identified with persona was living according to collective standards rather than individual values. They made choices based on what others expected or approved rather than on what genuinely mattered to them. Their lives were conventional and predictable because they followed well-worn social paths rather than discovering unique individual directions. But Jung did not advocate simply discarding the persona or rejecting all social adaptation. He recognized that the persona served necessary functions, and that complete rejection of social roles would lead to chaos and isolation. The goal was not to eliminate the persona, but to recognize it as one aspect of personality rather than the whole. You needed to be able to put on appropriate masks for different social contexts, while remaining aware that these were masks, performances for specific purposes, rather than expressions of your complete identity. This required developing what Jung called a flexible persona, the capacity to adopt appropriate roles when necessary, while being able to drop them when circumstances permitted more authentic expression. It also required maintaining clear awareness of the distinction between persona and genuine self, knowing when you were performing and when you were being real. This kind of conscious relationship to persona allowed you to function effectively in society without losing touch with your authentic nature. Jung also recognized that different cultures created different typical personas that shaped individual development in culture-specific ways. Western culture in Jung's time emphasized personas of rationality, individualism, productivity, and self-control. Eastern cultures often emphasized personas of harmony, collective loyalty, emotional restraint, and respect for authority. These cultural personas shaped how people presented themselves and what aspects of their nature they learned to suppress. Understanding these cultural patterns helped explain why people from different cultures often misunderstood each other, each seeing in the other's behavior a failure to perform the persona that seemed natural and necessary. The inflation of persona was a particular danger that Jung observed frequently in people who achieved social success and recognition. When others treated you according to your role or status, it was easy to begin believing that you actually were the important person that your persona represented. Doctors might believe they possessed godlike wisdom because patients treated them with deference. Professors might believe they were intellectual authorities on all subjects because students looked up to them. CEOs might believe they had superior judgment and ability because their positions gave them power over others. This inflation made people rigid, arrogant, and unable to learn or grow because they confused their social masks with their actual capacities and worth. Jung developed the concept of persona partly through observing his own tendency to identify with his role as doctor and authority figure. He noticed how easily he slipped into the persona of the wise healer who possessed answers to all psychological questions. This persona served him well in his professional work, but it became a barrier to genuine relationship and authentic self-expression. He had to work consciously to distinguish between his role as therapist and his actual human limitations and uncertainties. This work taught him that even someone dedicated to psychological consciousness could easily fall into persona identification without constant vigilance. Dream often revealed when persona identification had become too rigid, or when the gap between persona and authentic self had grown too wide. The unconscious compensated for one-sided persona identification by presenting images of the opposite, dreams of nakedness or of being inappropriately dressed, dreams of failing to perform one's role or of being exposed as a fraud. These dreams were not predictions of literal exposure, but the psyche's way of indicating that persona and reality had diverged too far and that adjustment was necessary. The withdrawal from excessive persona identification was a crucial step in the individuation process. It required acknowledging that the roles you played and the social identity you had constructed were not the whole truth about who you were. It meant recognizing that beneath the doctor, the teacher, the parent, the professional was a human being with doubts, fears, desires, and qualities that did not fit neatly into any social category. This recognition was both liberating and frightening, because it meant giving up the security of having a clearly defined social identity and facing the uncertainty of discovering who you were beneath the masks. But Jung insisted that this stripping away of persona was necessary for psychological health and for genuine relationship. Only when you could drop the mask, at least sometimes, and in some contexts, could you experience real intimacy and authentic connection with others. Only when you stopped living according to collective expectations could you discover your own unique path and purpose. Only when you distinguish between persona and self could you begin the real work of individuation and the journey toward wholeness. The persona was necessary for social life, but it could never be the basis for a fully lived human existence. At the deepest center of Jung's psychology stands a mystery that can barely be named or described. He called it the self, but this term is inadequate for what it attempts to designate. The self is not the ego, not consciousness, not personality in any ordinary sense. It is the archetype of wholeness and totality, the organizing principle that directs psychological development from within, the goal of individuation, and simultaneously its starting point. The self is both what you're trying to become and what you have always been beneath every layer of conditioning and unconscious identification. Jung's discovery of the self emerged from his own psychological crisis and from careful observation of his patients' dreams and fantasies. During his confrontation with the unconscious after breaking with Freud, Jung began painting circular images that emerged spontaneously without conscious planning. These mandalas, as they were called in Eastern traditions, appeared again and again with fourfold patterns of symmetry and balance. Jung initially did not understand what he was painting or why these particular forms kept appearing, but gradually he recognized that these images represented something within himself that was striving for wholeness and integration. When Jung examined his patients' dreams and active imagination material, he found the same symbols appearing spontaneously. People who had never been exposed to Eastern philosophy or religious art produced mandala images in their dreams. People going through profound psychological transformations painted circular patterns divided into 4 sections, or featuring 4 primary elements. These symbols could not be explained as cultural learning because they appeared even in children and in people with no knowledge of symbolic traditions. Jung concluded that they emerged from the collective unconscious as natural expressions of the psyche's drive toward wholeness. The self was paradoxical in every aspect of its nature. It was both the centre of the psyche and its total circumference, both the innermost point and the outermost boundary. It encompassed consciousness and unconsciousness, personal and collective dimensions of mind, ego and shadow, masculine and feminine. It was the unity that contained all opposites without eliminating their tension and difference. Trying to describe the self in logical terms was impossible, because it transcended the categories that ordinary thinking employed. Jung discovered that the self could be experienced but not fully known by consciousness. People reported encounters with the self that were numinous, that possessed the quality of the holy or the divine. These experiences were often overwhelming, flooding consciousness with energies and insights that could barely be contained or expressed. They left people with a sense of having touched something ultimate, something that gave meaning and purpose to existence itself. But when people tried to describe these experiences, in ordinary language they found words inadequate and could only resort to paradox and symbol. The relationship between the ego and the self was central to understanding psychological development and the process of individuation. In early life, the ego was weak and relatively undifferentiated from the unconscious. The infant experienced itself as continuous with its environment and with archetypal forces that would later be distinguished as separate from consciousness. The primary task of childhood and youth was to develop a strong ego that could maintain its boundaries against unconscious forces and adapt effectively to external reality. This necessary development created a separation between ego and self, with consciousness identifying itself as autonomous and independent. But this separation was never as complete as it seemed. The self continued to operate behind the scenes, directing development through dreams, through synchronistic events, through symptoms and crises that forced consciousness to pay attention to neglected aspects of psyche. The ego might believe it was making free choices based on conscious reasoning, but Jung understood that deeper patterns shape development in ways that only became visible in retrospect. The self was like a hidden author writing the story of your life, sometimes visible in its effects, but always operating from depths that consciousness could not directly perceive. The individuation process was essentially the establishment of a conscious relationship between ego and self. Instead of the ego believing itself to be the whole of personality, it learned to recognize itself as one element within a larger totality. Instead of consciousness attempting to control everything through willpower and rational planning, it learned to listen to the guidance of the self and to align itself with deeper purposes. This did not mean that the ego became passive or powerless, but that it learned to work in cooperation with unconscious processes, rather than fighting against them or remaining ignorant of their existence. Jung found that dreams were the primary way the self communicated with consciousness. Dreams brought images and symbols that compensated for one-sided conscious attitudes, that pointed toward neglected aspects of personality, that revealed the self's perspective on current situations and challenges. But dreams spoke in a symbolic language that consciousness had to learn to understand. The symbols in dreams were not arbitrary or meaningless, but expressed archetypal patterns and relationships that could not be conveyed in literal conceptual language. The mandala was the most important symbol of the self, appearing in dreams and spontaneous art when the psyche was striving for integration and wholeness. Jung studied mandalas from many religious and cultural traditions, and found remarkable similarities despite their diverse origins. The circular form represented totality and completion. The fourfold division represented the quaternity, the bringing together of four major aspects of consciousness or personality into balanced relationship. The center represented the self itself, the still point around which everything else revolved. But Jung discovered many other symbols of the self that appeared in dreams and myth. The divine child represented the self as unrealized potential, the seed of future development that contained all possibilities. The wise old man or woman represented the self as achieved wisdom and integration, the goal of development rather than its beginning. The sacred marriage or conjunctio represented the union of opposites within the self, particularly the integration of masculine and feminine. The tree represented the self as organic growth connecting depths and heights, earth and heaven. The jewel or pearl represented the self as precious essence hidden within ordinary life. Jung understood that the self was both personal and transpersonal. It was unique to each individual, the specific pattern of wholeness that represented your particular nature and destiny. But it was also connected to something universal and collective, participating in archetypal patterns that transcended individual existence. This dual nature explained why encounters with the self often felt both intimately personal and cosmically significant. You experienced it as your deepest truth, and simultaneously as connection to something infinite and eternal. The role of suffering in relation to the self was crucial to Jung's understanding. The self often made its presence known through suffering, through symptoms and crises that disrupted ordinary life and forced consciousness to change direction. A person might be pursuing goals that seemed perfectly reasonable from the ego's perspective, but that violated the self's deeper purposes. The result would be depression, anxiety, psychosomatic illness, or external catastrophes that prevented the ego from continuing on its chosen path. These sufferings were not meaningless, but were the self's way of asserting its authority and demanding recognition. Jung also recognized that the self could be dangerous when it manifested with overwhelming power. The experience Jung called inflation occurred when consciousness identified with the self rather than maintaining the necessary distinction between ego and archetype. Someone experiencing inflation might believe they were specially chosen or divinely inspired, that they possessed superhuman wisdom or power, that ordinary rules did not apply to them. This inflation was actually a form of unconsciousness, in which archetypal energy overwhelmed the ego's boundaries and rational capacities. It often preceded a compensatory deflation in which the person crashed into depression and a sense of worthlessness. The spiritual dimension of the self was undeniable in Jung's experience and observation. The self functions psychologically very much like what religious traditions called God or the divine. Encounters with the self possessed the numinous quality that Rudolf Otto had described as characteristic of religious experience. The symbols of the self were also the primary symbols of divinity across religious traditions. Jung was careful to avoid making metaphysical claims about whether the self was God or whether God existed independently of psychological experience, but he insisted that the self was a psychological reality that had to be taken seriously, and that functioned in human life as the source of ultimate meaning and purpose. The relationship between psychology and religion became clearer when understood through the concept of the self. Religious practices and symbols were ways of relating to the self, of acknowledging its reality and seeking alignment with its purposes. Prayer was a form of communication with the self. Ritual was a way of giving symbolic expression to archetypal realities. Religious art depicted symbols of the self in culturally specific forms. The goal of religious life, whether it was called salvation, enlightenment, or union with God, was essentially the same as the goal of individuation, the conscious realization of the self and the integration of ego consciousness with the larger totality of psyche. But Jung also understood that institutionalized religion often lost touch with the living reality of the self and became rigid and conventional. Religious forms that had originally emerged as authentic expressions of archetypal experience became empty rituals repeated without understanding. Dogmas that had originally pointed toward mysteries beyond rational comprehension became literalized and turned into obstacles rather than aids to genuine spiritual life. This was why so many modern people found traditional religion psychologically and spiritually unsatisfying, even though they still felt the need for transcendent meaning. Jung's concept of the self offered a way to recover authentic religious experience without requiring belief in traditional doctrines that seemed incompatible with modern knowledge. By understanding religious symbols as expressions of psychological realities, people could take them seriously without literalizing them. By recognizing that the encounter with the self was what religious traditions had always been pointing toward, people could honor their own experiences of the numinous without feeling obligated to accept metaphysical claims they found incredible. This approach to spirituality was neither conventionally religious nor simply secular, but opened a third way that acknowledged transcendent dimensions of human experience while remaining grounded in psychological observation and personal exploration. The journey toward the self was the central meaning of human life according to Jung's psychology. Everything else all the achievements and failures, relationships and experiences that filled a lifetime, gained their ultimate significance from whether they served or hindered this journey. The self was calling each person toward their own unique form of wholeness, toward the realization of their particular nature and potential. Answering that call required courage to face what had been avoided, honesty to acknowledge what had been denied, and faith that the journey had meaning even when its destination remained unclear. But for those willing to undertake it, the journey toward the self offered the only real possibility of a fully lived human life. Every night you descend into a world where the ordinary rules of physics and logic do not apply. In this realm the dead walk and speak, impossible transformations occur in an instant. You fly or fall or discover rooms in your house that do not exist in waking life. Most people dismiss these nightly journeys as meaningless noise, random neural firing without significance. But Jung understood that dreams were the primary language of the unconscious, messages from depths of psyche that could not speak in the rational discourse of waking consciousness. Learning to understand this symbolic language was essential for anyone seeking psychological wholeness or spiritual depth. Jung's approach to dreams was fundamentally different from Freud's reductive method. Freud believed that dreams disguised unacceptable wishes, particularly sexual desires that had been repressed. The dream's manifest content was a code that had to be translated back into the latent content that consciousness could not acknowledge directly. Dream interpretation for Freud meant stripping away the symbolic disguise to reveal the hidden wish beneath. But Jung saw dreams as genuine expressions rather than disguises, as the unconscious speaking in its own natural language rather than trying to hide something from consciousness. The symbolic language of dreams was not arbitrary or personal, but drew on universal archetypal patterns from the collective unconscious. This explained why certain symbols appeared again and again across different dreamers and different cultures. Water often represented the unconscious itself, the depths from which consciousness emerged. Houses represented the self or personality, with different rooms corresponding to different aspects of psyche. Animals often represented instinctual energies that consciousness had not integrated. Journeys represented the process of psychological development and transformation. These symbols were not fixed in meaning, but their archetypal foundation gave them a certain consistency across contexts. Jung discovered that dreams had a compensatory function, balancing one-sided conscious attitudes by presenting opposite perspectives from the unconscious. If consciousness was too rational and controlled, dreams might present wild and chaotic imagery that compensated for the excessive order. If consciousness was too extroverted and focused on external achievements, dreams might turn attention inward to neglected emotional and spiritual dimensions. If consciousness identified too strongly with positive self-images, dreams might present shadow material that revealed rejected aspects of personality. The unconscious did not simply agree with conscious attitudes, but maintained psychological balance by offering what consciousness lacked. This compensatory function meant that understanding dreams required knowing the dreamer's conscious situation and attitudes. The same symbol could mean very different things for different people depending on what they needed to balance their one-sidedness. A dream of flying might represent liberation for someone who was too grounded and practical, but it might represent dangerous inflation for someone already too detached from reality. A dream of being pursued might represent needed confrontation with the shadow for someone who avoided self-examination, but it might represent overwhelming pressure for someone already too self-critical. Context was everything in dream interpretation. Jung also distinguished between little dreams and big dreams. Little dreams dealt with the trivial concerns of daily life, processing experiences and emotions from waking hours without revealing anything particularly significant about deeper psychological processes. But big dreams possessed a numinous quality that announced their importance. They often featured archetypal symbols and mythological themes. They left the dreamer with a powerful feeling that something significant had been communicated, even if the meaning was not immediately clear. These dreams often came at crucial life transitions or during periods of intense psychological transformation. The technique Jung developed for working with dreams was what he called amplification. Instead of reducing the dream to a hidden meaning, amplification expanded around the dream images by gathering associations and parallels from mythology, religion, alchemy, and cultural symbolism. This process revealed the archetypal dimension of the dream and showed how personal psychological issues connected to universal human patterns. A dream of descending into a cave might be amplified by references to underworld journeys in mythology, to alchemical imagery of descent and transformation, to religious symbolism of death and rebirth. This amplification did not impose meaning on the dream, but unfolded the layers of significance that were already present in the symbolic image. Jung insisted that dream interpretation should never be formulaic or mechanical. There was no dream dictionary that could tell you what symbols meant, because their meaning depended on the dreamer's unique situation and the dream's specific context. The interpreter had to approach each dream as a new mystery to be explored, rather than as a puzzle to be solved through application of general rules. This required patience, openness to multiple possibilities, willingness to sit with uncertainty until the dream's meaning revealed itself through continued engagement. Active imagination was another technique Jung developed for working with unconscious material that appeared in dreams. Instead of just analysing the dream intellectually, you could return to it imaginatively while awake and allow it to continue. You might imagine speaking with dream figures and asking them questions, allowing them to respond in ways that often surprise conscious expectations. You might allow a dream scene to develop further, watching where it led without trying to control or direct it. This technique bridged the gap between dreaming and waking consciousness, allowing direct dialogue with unconscious contents. Jung discovered that dreams often came in series, with themes and symbols developing through multiple dreams over time. A single dream might be obscure or ambiguous, but when examined as part of a series, patterns emerged that revealed the unconscious's ongoing concerns and the direction of psychological development. He encouraged people to keep dream journals and to look for these larger patterns rather than trying to extract complete meaning from individual dreams in isolation. The unconscious was telling a story that unfolded over months and years, an understanding that story required patience and long-term attention. The role of dreams in the individuation process was central to Jung's psychology. As someone moved through the stages of psychological development, their dreams reflected and guided this movement. Early in individuation, dreams might focus on shadow material that needed to be integrated. As shadow work progressed, dreams might shift to Anima or Animus figures and the development of the contrasexual dimension. Later in the process, dreams might present symbols of the self and images of wholeness, indicating that consciousness was approaching a more integrated condition. The dreams did not simply reflect what was happening, but actively guided the process, showing what needed attention next and pointing toward the next stage of development. Jung also recognized that some dreams were prospective, pointing toward future developments rather than simply compensating for present attitudes. These dreams did not predict literal future events, but showed potential directions and possibilities that were emerging from unconscious processes. Someone might dream of a new house or a journey to an unknown destination before consciously recognizing that their life needed to move in a new direction. These prospective dreams helped prepare consciousness for changes that were necessary, but that the ego might resist if they came without warning. The spiritual dimension of dreams was particularly important in Jung's understanding. Some dreams were not merely psychological, but genuinely religious or mystical, presenting encounters with the numinous that transformed consciousness and provided direct experience of the sacred. These dreams often featured symbols of the self in its most transcendent forms, mandalas of extraordinary beauty and complexity, encounters with divine or archetypal figures who radiated overwhelming presence and authority. Jung believed these dreams came not from the personal unconscious, but from the deepest layers of the collective unconscious, where psyche touched something that could legitimately be called spiritual or divine. Modern culture's dismissal of dreams represented a catastrophic loss, according to Jung. For most of human history, dreams had been taken seriously as messages from gods or spirits, as visions that required interpretation and response. Indigenous cultures maintained sophisticated practices of dream interpretation and honoured dreamers as having access to knowledge unavailable in ordinary waking consciousness. But the Enlightenment's elevation of reason and empirical observation had declared dreams to be meaningless, and modern people had lost an essential source of self-knowledge and spiritual guidance. Jung spent decades analysing his own dreams and keeping detailed records of the dreams of his patients. He found that the unconscious possessed an intelligence and wisdom that often exceeded what consciousness could achieve through rational analysis. Dreams diagnosed psychological problems with remarkable precision. They revealed dynamics in relationships that the dreamer had not consciously recognized. They warned of dangers that rational assessment had missed. They offered creative solutions to problems that conscious effort could not solve. They provided moral guidance that surpassed conventional ethical reasoning. The unconscious was not a primitive or inferior aspect of mind, but a profound source of intelligence that complemented and often surpassed conscious capacities. But Jung also warned against becoming too fascinated with dreams or too dependent on unconscious guidance. The goal was not to replace consciousness with unconsciousness, but to establish a dialogue between them. Some people became so absorbed in their dream life that they neglected practical responsibilities and rational judgment. This was as one-sided as ignoring dreams completely. The ideal was a conscious ego that remained firmly grounded in reality while maintaining open communication with the unconscious through dreams and active imagination. Consciousness and unconsciousness each had their proper roles, and neither should dominate at the expense of the other. The art of dream interpretation could not be taught through simple rules or formulas, but had to be developed through practice and through cultivating a relationship with one's own unconscious. It required learning to think symbolically rather than literally, to appreciate images for what they evoked rather than demanding concrete rational meanings. It required patience to sit with ambiguity and mystery rather than rushing to premature interpretations. It required humility to recognize that the unconscious often understood more than consciousness, and that its perspective deserved respect even when it contradicted ego preferences and plans. For those willing to develop this art, dreams offered an inexhaustible source of insight, creativity, and guidance toward wholeness. In 1952, Jung published what would become one of his most controversial and misunderstood concepts. He called it synchronicity, and it challenged the fundamental assumptions of Western science about causality and the relationship between mind and matter. Jung was proposing that meaningful coincidences existed that could not be explained by ordinary cause and effect, that sometimes events in the external world corresponded to internal psychological states in ways that suggested a deeper connection between mind and reality than materialist philosophy allowed. The concept of synchronicity emerged from Jung's clinical experience and from events in his own life that seemed to defy rational explanation. He noticed that important psychological breakthroughs in therapy were often accompanied by striking external events that seemed symbolically related to the internal process. A patient might be describing a dream about a particular animal, and at that exact moment the animal might appear outside the window. Someone might be struggling with a particular psychological issue, and they might encounter a book or a stranger who provided exactly the insight they needed. These coincidences happened too frequently and were too meaningful to dismiss as mere chance. One of Jung's most famous examples involved a patient who was highly rational and resistant to psychological exploration. She was telling Jung about a dream in which she received a golden scarab, an Egyptian symbol of rebirth and transformation. At that precise moment, Jung heard tapping at his office window. He opened the window and caught a rosechafer beetle, the closest thing to a golden scarab that existed in Switzerland. This impossible coincidence shattered the patient's rigid rationalism and opened her to genuine psychological work. Jung understood that something more than chance was operating in such moments. Synchronistic events typically possessed several characteristics that distinguished them from ordinary coincidences. They involved a meaningful connection between an internal psychological state and an external physical event, but there was no causal link between them. They often occurred at moments of intense emotion or during important transitions and transformations. They left the person who experienced them with a powerful sense that something significant had happened, even if the significance could not be rationally explained. And they often seemed to carry a message or to point towards something that consciousness needed to recognize. Jung's explanation for synchronicity drew on concepts from physics, particularly quantum mechanics, which had revealed that the relationship between observer and observed was more complex than classical physics had assumed. He proposed that psyche and matter were not absolutely separate, but were two aspects of an underlying unity that he called the unus mundus, the one world. At the deepest level of reality, the distinction between inner and outer, between mental and physical, broke down. Synchronistic events were moments when this underlying unity became visible, when the veil between psyche and matter temporarily lifted. The Chinese concept of the Tao and the I Ching's understanding of time as qualitative rather than merely quantitative influenced Jung's thinking about synchronicity. Eastern philosophy had never made the sharp distinction between mind and matter that characterized Western thought. It understood reality as a continuous whole, in which everything was connected through subtle correspondences and patterns. The I Ching operated on the principle that the moment when you consulted it was not random but meaningful, that the configuration of coins or yarrow stalks reflected the quality of that particular moment in time and revealed its hidden significance. Jung conducted an experiment with astrological correspondences to investigate synchronicity empirically. He examined the birth charts of married couples to see if there were more conjunctions between their charts than would be expected by chance. The initial results showed statistically significant correlations, though these disappeared when he tried to replicate the study with larger samples. Jung concluded that synchronistic phenomena were not consistently reproducible in the way that causal processes were, but they tended to cluster around moments of high emotional intensity and psychological significance. The concept of synchronicity had profound implications for understanding the relationship between psychological work and external life circumstances. It suggested that inner transformation was not isolated from outer events, but that changes in consciousness could be accompanied by corresponding changes in external situations. Someone who did serious work integrating their shadow might find that difficult relationships spontaneously improved without any conscious effort to change them. Someone who connected with their deeper sense of purpose might encounter unexpected opportunities that aligned with that purpose. The boundary between inner and outer was more permeable than conventional thinking assumed. But Jung also warned against the dangers of seeing synchronicity everywhere and treating every coincidence as deeply meaningful. Some coincidences were indeed just chance with no particular significance. The challenge was discriminating between ordinary chance and genuine synchronicity, and this discrimination required psychological maturity and honest self-examination. People prone to inflation or magical thinking might see synchronicity in random events and use this as evidence of their special status or cosmic importance. This was a distortion of the concept that increased unconsciousness rather than serving genuine psychological development. Synchronicity also raised difficult questions about divination practices like the I Ching, tarot, and astrology. If synchronistic principles operated in reality, then these practices might actually work not through causal mechanisms but through meaningful acausal correspondences. The configuration of cards or the positions of planets at birth might reflect the quality of a moment or a life in ways that could provide genuine insight. But Jung insisted that these practices should be used with careful attention to psychological projection and self-deception. The symbols in tarot or the interpretations in astrology could easily become screens for projecting what you wanted to see rather than genuine perception of synchronistic meaning. The relationship between synchronicity and the archetype was central to Jung's understanding of the phenomenon. Synchronistic events typically involved archetypal symbols or situations. The golden scarab in Jung's example was not just any insect, but one that carried profound symbolic meaning connected to transformation and rebirth. Jung proposed that archetypes existed not only in the psyche, but as ordering principles in the world itself, as patterns that shaped both psychological experience and physical events. When an archetype was activated in the unconscious, it could create a field that influenced external events, producing synchronistic correspondences between inner and outer. Jung's work with synchronicity anticipated later developments in physics and complexity theory that questioned simple mechanistic causality. Quantum entanglement demonstrated that particles could remain connected across vast distances in ways that seemed to transcend space and time. Chaos theory revealed that tiny changes could produce massive effects through nonlinear dynamics. Systems theory showed that wholes possessed properties that could not be reduced to the sum of their parts. These scientific developments suggested that reality was far more interconnected and mysterious than 19th century materialism had assumed, and they made Jung's concept of synchronicity seem less outlandish and more like a genuine insight into the nature of existence. The experience of synchronicity often produced a shift in consciousness that Jung considered essential for psychological and spiritual development. When you experienced a genuinely synchronistic event, you could no longer maintain the illusion that you were a completely separate, isolated individual in a meaningless universe. You experienced directly that you were participating in a larger whole, that your inner life was connected to something beyond your personal boundaries, that reality possessed meaning and pattern, even if that meaning could not be completely grasped by rational consciousness. This experience of connection and meaning was itself therapeutic and transformative. Jung believed that synchronistic experiences became more frequent and more noticeable as people progressed in their individuation. As consciousness expanded and integrated unconscious contents, the barrier between inner and outer became more permeable, and the underlying unity became more visible. This did not mean that individuated people could control external events through their inner states, but it did mean that they became more attuned to the meaningful correspondences that were always present, but usually unnoticed. They learned to read the book of the world as well as the book of the soul, seeing how both texts revealed the same archetypal patterns and meanings. The concept of synchronicity also changed how Jung understood fate and destiny. Instead of seeing human life as determined entirely by prior causes or as completely free and undetermined, synchronicity suggested a middle way. Life followed meaningful patterns that were neither purely causal nor purely random. These patterns emerge from the self and from archetypal structures in the collective unconscious, creating what Jung called the transcendent function, the capacity of the psyche to unite opposites and move toward wholeness. Synchronistic events were markers along this path, signs that confirmed you were moving in the right direction or warnings that adjustment was needed. In his final years, Jung became increasingly interested in synchronicity as a bridge between psychology and spirituality, between scientific understanding and mystical experience. The phenomenon suggested that reality was fundamentally meaningful rather than meaningless, that consciousness participated in the world rather than merely observing it from outside, that spiritual insights about the interconnection of all things might be more than comforting fantasies. Synchronicity pointed toward a worldview that honored both scientific rigor and spiritual experience, that acknowledged mystery without abandoning rationality, that opened space for wonder while remaining grounded in careful observation of what actually happened in human experience. One of Jung's most enduring contributions to psychology was his theory of psychological types, a systematic way of understanding fundamental differences in how people perceive reality and make decisions. This theory emerged from Jung's observation that intelligent people of goodwill often could not understand each other, that they seemed to live in different worlds even when examining the same situation. Jung recognized that these differences were not simply matters of opinion, but reflected fundamental orientations of consciousness that shaped all perception and judgment. The foundation of Jung's typology was the distinction between two basic attitudes of consciousness that he called extraversion and introversion. These terms have entered common usage but are often misunderstood as simply referring to social behavior or preference for solitude versus company. For Jung, extraversion and introversion were far more fundamental, representing opposite directions of psychic energy and opposite relationships between consciousness and the unconscious. The extrovert-oriented consciousness toward the external world of objects, people, and circumstances. Psychic energy flowed outward, and the extrovert found renewal and vitality through engagement with external reality. The extrovert's thinking was shaped by objective facts and collective values. Their feeling responses were oriented toward maintaining harmony with their environment and other people. Their perceptions focused on what was actually present in the external world. Their intuition pointed toward possibilities in the objective situation. For the extrovert, the subject adapted to the object, and consciousness conformed to external reality. The introvert oriented consciousness toward the internal world of thoughts, feelings, and subjective impressions. Psychic energy flowed inward, and the introvert found renewal through reflection and inner experience. The introvert's thinking was shaped by internal principles and subjective understanding. Their feeling responses emerged from internal values and standards. Their perceptions focused on the subjective impression that external objects created. Their intuition pointed toward inner possibilities and meanings. For the introvert, the object adapted to the subject, and external reality was interpreted through the lens of inner experience. Jung emphasized that neither attitude was superior to the other, and that both were necessary for complete understanding of reality. The extrovert grasped the objective dimensions of situations that the introvert might miss. The introvert perceived subjective meanings and depth that the extrovert overlooked. Problems arose when people identified exclusively with one attitude and devalued the other, or when they tried to force their own attitude on others who were fundamentally oriented differently. But the distinction between extraversion and introversion was only the first level of Jung's typology. He identified 4 fundamental psychological functions that consciousness could use to engage with reality: thinking, feeling, sensation, and intuition. Thinking evaluated through logical analysis and rational judgment. Feeling evaluated through assessment of value and emotional significance. Sensation perceived through the 5 senses what was actually present in the immediate moment. Intuition perceived possibilities, meanings, and patterns that were not immediately visible to sense perception. These 4 functions form 2 pairs of opposites. Thinking and feeling were both judging functions that evaluated and made decisions about experience, but they used opposite criteria: rational logic versus value assessment. Sensation and intuition were both perceiving functions that took in information about reality, but they focused on opposite aspects: actual present facts versus potential future possibilities. Jung represented these relationships in a quaternity, with thinking opposite feeling and sensation opposite intuition, and with extraversion and introversion as the 2 poles that coloured all 4 functions. Every person possessed all 4 functions, but they were not equally developed. One function became dominant or superior, the most conscious and differentiated tool that the person used to navigate reality. The function opposite to the dominant one remained inferior, the least developed and most unconscious aspect of psychological functioning. The other 2 functions were auxiliary, more developed than the inferior function, but less prominent than the dominant one. This created an individual's functional type, which combined with their attitude type to create 8 basic psychological types. The extroverted thinking type lived by logical principles applied to external facts and objective data. They were often scientists, engineers, and administrators who excelled at organizing and systematizing information. But their inferior feeling function meant they often struggled with personal relationships and could be insensitive to emotional dynamics and values. The introverted thinking type built elaborate theoretical systems based on internal logical principles. They were often philosophers and theoretical scientists who developed new paradigms for understanding reality. But their inferior feeling could leave them isolated and unable to connect their brilliant ideas to human concerns. The extroverted feeling type evaluated everything according to collective values and social harmony. They were often skilled at diplomacy and creating pleasant social atmospheres, but their inferior thinking meant they might lack logical rigour and could be swayed by popular opinion rather than objective analysis. The introverted feeling type possessed deep internal values and could perceive the emotional truth of situations with remarkable accuracy. But their inferior thinking and their introverted orientation meant they often could not articulate their insights or influence the external world effectively. The extroverted sensation type focused on immediate concrete reality and practical concerns. They were often athletes, artists working with physical materials, and people skilled at navigating the physical world. But their inferior intuition meant they might miss larger patterns and future implications of present actions. The introverted sensation type perceived the subjective impression created by sensory experience rather than just the objective facts. They were often artists who could convey how things felt rather than simply how they looked. But their inferior intuition could leave them trapped in subjective reactions without awareness of broader meanings. The extroverted intuitive type constantly scanned the environment for new possibilities and emerging potentials. They were often entrepreneurs, innovators, and people who could see opportunities that others missed. But their inferior sensation meant they might be impractical and ungrounded, moving from one exciting possibility to another without following through. The introverted intuitive type perceived inner visions and possibilities that arose from the unconscious. They were often mystics, visionaries, and artists who brought forth images from the collective unconscious. But their inferior sensation could leave them completely detached from physical reality and practical necessities. Jung emphasized that understanding psychological types was not about putting people into rigid categories, but about recognizing the one-sidedness of every conscious attitude. Whatever function was dominant inevitably created a shadow, and the inferior function carried qualities that consciousness had rejected, but that were essential for psychological wholeness. The task of individuation included developing the inferior function, not to make it dominant, but to bring it into some degree of consciousness and integration with the superior function. The development of the inferior function was one of the most difficult challenges in psychological work, because it required giving up the security and competence of the dominant function and entering territory where you felt clumsy and incompetent. A dominant thinking type had to learn to value and trust feeling, even though feeling seemed irrational and unreliable. A dominant sensation type had to learn to honor intuition, even though intuition seemed vague and ungrounded. This work typically became necessary in the second half of life, when the one-sidedness of the dominant function had been exhausted and new dimensions of personality needed to be developed. Jung's typology also explained why certain people immediately understood and appreciated each other, while others remained perpetually baffled by each other's perspectives. People who shared the same dominant function and attitude spoke the same psychological language and found communication effortless. But people with opposite types experienced each other as incomprehensible, or even threatening. The extroverted thinking type could not understand why the introverted feeling type seemed so illogical and subjective. The introverted intuitive type could not understand why the extroverted sensation type seemed so superficial and literal. These differences created conflicts in relationships, in work settings, and in cultural and political life. Understanding psychological types could reduce these conflicts by revealing that different perspectives were not simply wrong, but reflected fundamentally different ways of engaging with reality. The challenge was not to eliminate differences, but to appreciate the value of opposite perspectives, and to recognize that complete understanding required multiple viewpoints. An organization needed both thinking types who could analyze logically and feeling types who could assess human factors. A creative project needed both sensation types who could attend to concrete details and intuitive types who could envision new possibilities. Wholeness existed not in individuals perfecting their dominant function, but in groups and relationships that brought together complementary types. Jung applied his typology not only to individuals but to cultures and historical periods. Western civilization since the Enlightenment had emphasized extraversion, thinking and sensation, creating a culture oriented toward external achievements, logical analysis, and empirical facts. This produced tremendous scientific and technological progress, but created a corresponding shadow of neglected introversion, feeling, and intuition. Eastern cultures had often emphasized introversion and intuition, creating rich spiritual traditions, but sometimes at the expense of practical development and rational organization. The challenge for global civilization was integrating these opposite cultural orientations rather than having one dominate and repress the other. The psychological types were not fixed or unchangeable, but represented habitual patterns that consciousness had adopted and that could be modified through awareness and effort. Someone with dominant thinking could develop their feeling function through deliberate attention to values and emotional life. Someone with dominant sensation could cultivate intuition through imaginative practices and openness to symbolic meanings. But this development was gradual and required patience. It could not be forced through willpower alone, but required allowing the inferior function to emerge naturally from the unconscious and learning to trust its unfamiliar perspective. In Jung's final understanding, the typology was a tool for understanding psychological diversity and for recognizing the one-sidedness of all conscious attitudes. It was not the final word on human personality, but a map of one dimension of psychological structure. The complete map of personality required also understanding the relationship between consciousness and unconscious, the dynamics of archetypes and complexes, the process of individuation, and the role of the self as organizing center. The typology was one piece of a larger puzzle, valuable for the insights it provided, but inadequate by itself for complete psychological understanding. Jung's relationship with religion was complex and often misunderstood. He was neither a conventional believer nor a simple atheist, but something far more interesting and challenging. He approached religion as a psychologist, investigating religious experience as a natural phenomenon that revealed essential truths about human nature and consciousness. What he discovered was that religion was not an optional cultural addition to human life, but a psychological necessity, that the religious impulse emerged from the deepest structures of the psyche, and that modern humanity's abandonment of religion created psychological and spiritual crises that no amount of material progress could resolve. Jung's early life exposed him to both the power and the problems of traditional Christianity. His father was a Protestant minister, but Jung observed that his father's faith seemed hollow and conventional, a matter of professional duty rather than living experience. His mother possessed a darker and more mysterious religiosity that fascinated and disturbed the young Jung. He himself had powerful religious experiences as a child and adolescent, visions and intuitions that seemed to come from a source beyond ordinary consciousness. But he could not reconcile these experiences with the dogmatic Christianity that was taught in church and school. The break with Freud partly concerned religion. Freud viewed religion as an illusion, a projection of infantile wishes onto an imaginary cosmic father figure. Religious beliefs were symptoms of psychological immaturity that humanity needed to outgrow through rational enlightenment and scientific education. But Jung could not accept this reductive interpretation. He saw too much in religious experience that could not be explained as mere wish fulfillment or neurotic symptom. Religious symbols carried meanings that psychology needed to take seriously rather than explaining away. Jung proposed a revolutionary way of understanding religion that transcended the debate between believers and skeptics. He argued that the truth or falsity of metaphysical religious claims was not primarily what mattered psychologically. What mattered was that religious symbols expressed and engaged archetypal realities in the collective unconscious. God might or might not exist as an independent metaphysical being, but God certainly existed as a psychological reality, as the most powerful archetype in human experience. The encounter with this archetype was what people actually experienced in genuine religious moments, regardless of their theological interpretations. This psychological approach to religion did not reduce religious experience to nothing but psychology. Jung insisted that when someone encountered the archetype of God or the self, they were encountering something real and objective, not merely projecting their own subjective fantasies. The archetypes existed in the collective unconscious as autonomous realities with their own nature and purposes. The encounter with them was as real as any encounter with external objects, perhaps more real because it touched dimensions of existence that transcended ordinary space and time. Psychology could investigate and describe these encounters without making claims about whether the archetypes corresponded to metaphysical entities existing independently of the human psyche. Jung discovered that religious experiences shared certain characteristics that revealed their archetypal foundation. They possessed what Rudolf Otto called the numinous quality, a sense of encountering something wholly other that inspired both fascination and terror. They transformed consciousness in ways that felt like rebirth or conversion, creating before and after moments that divided a life into separate chapters. They conveyed meanings that could not be adequately expressed in literal conceptual language, but required symbols and metaphors. They produced effects that lasted throughout a lifetime, providing orientation and purpose that sustained people through suffering and uncertainty. The symbols of religion expressed universal archetypal patterns in culturally specific forms. The Trinity in Christianity represented the archetype of the threefold nature of reality and consciousness. The Virgin Mary represented the archetype of the Great Mother in her redemptive rather than devouring aspect. Christ represented the archetype of the self, the divine human unity that each individual was called to realize. The crucifixion represented the necessary suffering and sacrifice involved in psychological and spiritual transformation. The resurrection represented the rebirth that could follow the death of old identities and attachments. These symbols were not arbitrary inventions, but authentic expressions of psychological realities that existed in all human beings. But Jung also recognized that institutionalized religion often became rigid and lost touch with the living archetypal realities it originally expressed. Religious forms that had emerged as spontaneous expressions of numinous experience became empty rituals repeated without understanding or genuine feeling. Doctrines that had pointed toward mysteries beyond comprehension became literalized into propositions that believers were required to accept without question. Religious authority that should have guided individuals toward their own encounters with the sacred instead substituted external obedience for inner transformation. When this happened, religion became an obstacle to genuine spiritual life rather than a path toward it. The crisis of religion in the modern world resulted partly from the Enlightenment's emphasis on reason and empirical verification. Religious claims that had once been accepted on faith or tradition now faced demands for rational justification and scientific evidence. When religious institutions tried to defend their doctrines as literal historical and metaphysical truths, they found themselves in conflict with science and critical scholarship. Many educated people concluded that religion was simply false and that psychological maturity required abandoning religious beliefs entirely. But Jung argued that this conclusion missed what was actually valuable and true in religious experience. The modern abandonment of religion left people psychologically and spiritually impoverished. Jung observed that many of his patients suffered from what he called loss of soul, a condition of meaninglessness and disconnection that no amount of material success could remedy. These were not people with conventional psychiatric disorders, but people who had lost contact with the deeper sources of meaning and purpose. They had achieved everything that secular culture promised would bring happiness, but found themselves empty and despairing. What they needed was not better adaptation to social demands, or more rational understanding of their problems, but reconnection with the archetypal dimensions of experience that religion had traditionally provided. Jung argued that secular ideologies often functioned as substitute religions, providing the meaning and purpose that traditional religion no longer supplied. Communism and fascism possessed all the features of religions: absolute doctrines, redemptive narratives of historical salvation, demands for total commitment, persecution of heretics, martyrs willing to die for the cause. But these secular religions lacked the psychological wisdom that traditional religions had accumulated over millennia. They identified ultimate meaning with temporal political goals and promised heaven on earth through human effort alone. When these promises inevitably failed, the result was disillusionment and nihilistic despair. The psychology of religion also revealed why certain religious developments had occurred in history. The Protestant Reformation represented partly a psychological necessity for greater individual relationship to God, a rebellion against excessive mediation by institutional authority. The emergence of Mary as a central figure in Catholic devotion responded to a psychological need for the feminine dimension of divinity that the exclusively masculine Trinity could not satisfy. The Eastern Orthodox emphasis on mystical experience rather than rational theology preserved direct encounter with the numinous against the West's tendency toward abstraction and intellectualization. These developments were not merely historical accidents, but expressions of archetypal necessities in collective psychology. Jung believed that the future of religion lay not in abandoning it entirely, nor in returning to pre-modern literalism, but in a new approach that honoured religious experience while acknowledging modern critical consciousness. People needed to understand religious symbols as pointing towards psychological and spiritual realities, rather than as literal descriptions of historical events or metaphysical facts. They needed to develop their own direct relationship to the archetypal dimension of experience, rather than depending entirely on institutional mediation. They needed to recognize that religious truth was symbolic truth, conveying meanings that could not be captured in literal propositions, but that were nonetheless genuine and essential for complete human life. This new approach to religion required what Jung called psychological consciousness, the capacity to recognize when you were encountering archetypal realities and to relate to them consciously, rather than being possessed by them unconsciously. Traditional religion often produced possession, identification with archetypes that inflated the ego and created fanaticism. But conscious religion involved maintaining the crucial distinction between ego and archetype, recognizing the power and reality of the sacred while avoiding the delusion that you yourself were divine or specially chosen. This balance was difficult to achieve and required psychological maturity that conventional religion often did not cultivate. Jung's own religious position remained paradoxical and difficult to categorize. When asked if he believed in God, he famously replied that he did not need to believe because he knew. This was not a claim to certain knowledge of God's metaphysical existence, but a statement about direct psychological experience. Jung had encountered the archetype of God in his own inner work and in his clinical observation of others. This encounter was as real and undeniable as any sensory perception, perhaps more so. Whether this psychological reality corresponded to a metaphysical divine being existing independently of human consciousness, Jung considered unknowable, and ultimately not the most important question. What mattered psychologically was that human beings needed connection to something greater than the ego, something that provided ultimate meaning and purpose, something that could be called sacred or divine. Without this connection, consciousness remained trapped in its own narrow concerns, and life became meaningless. With this connection, even suffering and death could be given meaning, and could be faced with courage and acceptance. Religion at its best provided this connection, and helped individuals navigate the journey from ego consciousness toward realization of the self. Religion at its worst became a substitute for genuine experience, an opiate that dulled awareness rather than expanding it, a collective narcotic that prevented individuation rather than fostering it. The challenge for modern humanity was recovering the genuine religious function, while avoiding both naive literalism and reductive skepticism. Jung watched the 20th century unfold with the eyes of a prophet who had foreseen the catastrophe but could not prevent it. The two world wars, the rise of totalitarian movements, the Holocaust, the nuclear threat, all confirmed his darkest predictions about what happened when civilization lost its connection to the unconscious and to the sacred dimensions of existence. But Jung understood that these external horrors were symptoms of a deeper crisis, a spiritual and psychological breakdown that affected not only the perpetrators of atrocities, but the entire modern world. This was the crisis of meaning, the loss of connection to sources of transcendent purpose and value that had sustained human life throughout history. The roots of this crisis lay in the very achievements that modern civilization celebrated most proudly. The scientific revolution had revealed the mechanisms of nature and given humanity unprecedented power over the physical world. The Enlightenment had elevated reason as the supreme authority and promised that rational inquiry could solve all human problems. The Industrial Revolution had created material abundance unimaginable to previous generations. Democracy had liberated individuals from traditional hierarchies and proclaimed universal human rights. These developments represented genuine progress in many dimensions of human life, but they came at a terrible cost that was only becoming visible in the 20th century. Modern consciousness had become radically one-sided, identifying exclusively with rationality and empirical observation, while dismissing or repressing everything that could not be measured or controlled. The unconscious, with its irrational energies and archetypal patterns, was declared to be primitive residue that enlightened humanity needed to outgrow. Intuition and symbolic thinking were dismissed as inferior to logical analysis and literal description. Religious and spiritual experiences were reduced to neurotic symptoms or comforting illusions. The result was a civilization that was extraordinarily developed in certain dimensions while remaining psychologically and spiritually infantile. Jung recognized that this one-sided development created an enormous shadow that could not remain repressed indefinitely. All the irrational and instinctual energies that consciousness denied continued to operate in the unconscious, gaining power precisely because they were not acknowledged. All the violence and tribalism that modern civilization claimed to have transcended continued to exist beneath the surface of rational social order. All the religious needs that secularism dismissed as superstition sought expression through substitute forms that lacked the wisdom of traditional religious frameworks. The eruption of this shadow into collective consciousness produced the catastrophes that shock the 20th century, but that Jung had anticipated with remarkable precision. The First World War shattered the illusion that rational progress was inevitable and that Western civilization had achieved a stable condition of enlightened peace. The war revealed that technological sophistication without psychological development created unprecedented capacity for destruction. Modern nations with advanced science and democratic institutions behaved toward each other with tribalistic hatred and glorified mass slaughter as heroic sacrifice. The war demonstrated that rationality could be used in service of irrational collective passions, and that education and culture provided no immunity against possession by unconscious forces. But the world learned nothing fundamental from this catastrophe. The aftermath of the war created conditions that made an even greater disaster inevitable. The Treaty of Versailles imposed humiliating terms on Germany that wounded national pride and created economic desperation. The Russian Revolution established a totalitarian system based on materialist ideology that promised earthly paradise through violent elimination of class enemies. Fascism arose as a reaction against both liberal democracy and communism, offering a return to mythic nationalism and authoritarian leadership. These movements all represented eruptions of the collective unconscious in destructive forms that conventional political analysis could not adequately explain or address. Jung understood that the appeal of totalitarian movements was fundamentally religious and psychological rather than merely political or economic. People who had lost connection to traditional sources of meaning and community were desperate for something that would give their lives purpose and make them feel part of something larger than themselves. Totalitarian ideologies provided exactly this, offering comprehensive worldviews that explained everything, redemptive narratives that promised salvation through collective struggle, and powerful symbols that engaged archetypal energies. The Nazi movement in particular represented the return of repressed Germanic paganism, with its worship of blood and soil, its glorification of the warrior hero, its apocalyptic vision of final battle between racial enemies. The Holocaust revealed the depths of evil that modern civilization could produce when technological efficiency was combined with complete loss of moral and spiritual constraint. The systematic murder of millions of people was carried out by educated members of one of the most culturally advanced nations in Europe. The perpetrators were not monsters, but ordinary people who had been possessed by collective psychosis, who had projected their own shadows onto Jews and other designated enemies, who had identified with archetypal energies of destruction without any conscious recognition of what they were doing. Jung saw in these events confirmation of his warnings about the dangers of unconsciousness and the catastrophic potential of the repressed shadow. But Jung also recognized that the crisis was not limited to Germany or to fascism. The Allied nations and democratic societies suffered from their own forms of shadow possession, their own losses of meaning and spiritual grounding. The dropping of atomic bombs on Japanese cities demonstrated that the capacity for mass destruction and moral numbness was not limited to totalitarian regimes. The Cold War arms race showed that fear and paranoia could drive supposedly rational nations toward potential extinction of all life on Earth. The problem was not simply that some people or nations were evil, but that modern civilization as a whole had lost its psychological and spiritual foundations. The post-war period brought material prosperity to Western nations, but did not resolve the underlying crisis of meaning. Jung observed that despite unprecedented economic abundance and technological convenience, people continued to suffer from depression, anxiety, addiction, and what he called the neurosis of meaninglessness. They had everything that previous generations had struggled to achieve but found their lives hollow and purposeless. They were free from external constraint but experienced this freedom as burden rather than liberation, because they had no inner guidance about how to use their freedom. They had information but not wisdom, pleasure but not joy, existence but not genuine life. Jung identified several dimensions of this modern crisis that required understanding and attention. The dominance of collective consciousness meant that individuals had lost touch with their own unique nature and potential. They defined themselves entirely through social roles and collective values, becoming interchangeable parts in mass society rather than discovering their individual vocations and destinies. The persona had become so rigid and comprehensive that it left no space for authentic self-expression or inner development. People went through life without ever encountering their own souls, dying without having truly lived. The neglect of the unconscious meant that modern people had cut themselves off from sources of creativity, wisdom, and renewal that could only come from depths of psyche beyond rational control. They relied exclusively on conscious planning and willpower, exhausting themselves through constant effort without accessing the natural healing and transformative capacities of the unconscious. They suffered from what Jung called loss of instinct, the inability to respond appropriately to life situations because they had lost connection to natural psychological wisdom that operated beneath the level of conscious reasoning. The devaluation of symbolic and mythological consciousness meant that modern people could not integrate the numinous experiences that occasionally broke through into awareness. When they encountered the archetypal dimension through dreams, through powerful emotions, through moments of vision or inspiration, they had no framework for understanding and working with these experiences. They either dismissed them as meaningless or became overwhelmed and possessed by them. Traditional cultures had possessed elaborate mythologies and religious practices that helped people relate to archetypal energies consciously. Modern secular culture had abandoned these frameworks without developing adequate replacements. The triumph of extraversion meant that modern consciousness was oriented almost exclusively toward the external world of objects, achievements, and social validation. Introversion, with its attention to inner experience and subjective depth, was devalued as antisocial and unproductive. The result was a culture of constant distraction and stimulation that prevented the inner quiet necessary for genuine psychological and spiritual development. People filled every moment with activity and entertainment, terrified of the silence in which they might encounter their own souls and the questions they had spent their lives avoiding. The dominance of thinking and sensation functions meant that modern culture had systematically neglected feeling and intuition. Feeling, in Jung's technical sense of value assessment and emotional significance, was dismissed as irrational and subjective. Intuition, the perception of possibilities and meanings beyond immediate facts, was considered unreliable and impractical. The result was a culture that was sophisticated in analysis and manipulation of physical reality, but impoverished in wisdom about what ultimately mattered and what life was actually for. Modern people could do almost anything but had lost all sense of what was worth doing. Jung saw that this crisis could not be resolved through more of what had created it. More rational analysis, more technological development, more social engineering, more economic growth would only deepen the one-sidedness and strengthen the shadow. What was needed was a fundamental reorientation of consciousness, a recovery of dimensions of human experience that modernity had rejected. This required individuals willing to undertake the difficult work of psychological development, even when their culture provided little support or understanding for such efforts. This solution began with acknowledging the reality and autonomy of the unconscious. Modern people needed to recognize that consciousness was not the whole of psyche, but only its surface, that beneath conscious awareness lay depths that possessed their own intelligence and purposes. They needed to establish a dialogue with the unconscious through attention to dreams, through active imagination, through openness to symbolic and mythological dimensions of experience. This did not mean abandoning rationality, but balancing it with other ways of knowing that complemented and enriched rational understanding. The solution also required confronting the shadow, both personal and collective. Modern individuals needed to acknowledge the darkness within themselves, rather than projecting it onto others. Modern nations needed to recognize their own capacity for evil, rather than seeing themselves as purely enlightened and their enemies as purely barbaric. This confrontation was painful because it shattered comforting illusions of moral superiority and rational control. But without it, the shadow would continue to erupt in destructive ways that became increasingly dangerous as technological power increased. The solution demanded recovery of genuine religious or spiritual life that could provide transcendent meaning without requiring return to pre-modern literalism or institutional authoritarianism. Modern people needed to recognize that the religious impulse was not neurotic immaturity, but psychological necessity. That consciousness needed connection to something larger than itself to avoid nihilistic despair. This connection could be found through many paths, through depth psychology itself, through authentic engagement with traditional religious symbols understood psychologically, through direct experience of the numinous in nature, art or meditation, through the process of individuation that led to encounter with the self. Jung believed that the transformation of civilization depended ultimately on the transformation of individuals. Collective problems could not be solved through collective action alone because collective action always remained vulnerable to possession by unconscious forces when the individuals composing the collective remained unconscious. But individuals who had done genuine psychological work, who had integrated their shadows and established conscious relationship with the unconscious, who had undertaken the journey of individuation, could contribute something genuinely new to collective life. They could resist mass movements and collective psychoses. They could bring genuinely individual perspectives rather than simply repeating collective attitudes. They could serve as small lights in the darkness, not saving the world through heroic action, but maintaining consciousness and wholeness in the face of collective unconsciousness and fragmentation. This was Jung's hope for the future, modest but genuine. The crisis of meaning would not be resolved quickly or completely. The one-sidedness of modern consciousness would continue to create problems and catastrophes, but gradually, through the efforts of individuals willing to undertake difficult psychological work, through the slow accumulation of consciousness, through the patient integration of what had been rejected and repressed, humanity might achieve a more balanced and complete form of consciousness. This new consciousness would integrate rather than reject rationality, would honor both scientific understanding and spiritual wisdom, would balance individual autonomy with recognition of participation in larger wholes, would unite progress in external mastery with development in inner wisdom. This was the vision that sustained Jung's work, and that he offered as possibility and hope to those who would listen. In the 1940s, when Jung was already in his 60s and had established his reputation as one of the 20th century's most important psychologists, he made a discovery that would occupy him for the rest of his life. He encountered the symbolic system of medieval and Renaissance alchemy and recognized in it a complete map of the psychological transformation he called individuation. This discovery came as a profound confirmation of his own insights, and as a revelation that the psychological wisdom he had been developing already existed in symbolic form, hidden in texts that the modern world had dismissed as primitive pseudoscience. Jung's path to alchemy began with a dream that presented him with an image he could not immediately understand. In the dream, he found himself in a strange house with many levels, and in the deepest cellar he discovered a mysterious substance that seemed to possess magical properties. As he worked with this dream, he realized it was pointing him towards something in the collective unconscious that he had not yet fully explored. Around this same time, a friend gave him a copy of an alchemical text, and Jung began to see connections between the symbolic language of alchemy and the psychological processes he had been observing in himself and his patients. The history of alchemy stretched back to ancient Egypt and continued through the Middle Ages and Renaissance, finally declining in the 17th and 18th centuries when modern chemistry emerged. Conventional scholars understood alchemy as failed chemistry, a superstitious attempt to transform base metals into gold and to discover an elixir of immortality. The alchemists were seen as deluded proto-scientists whose work had no value once genuine chemistry had developed. But Jung recognized that this interpretation completely missed what the alchemists were actually doing. The alchemists were not primarily interested in literal chemical transformation of metals. They were engaged in a spiritual and psychological opus, a great work of transformation that used chemical procedures as symbolic representations of inner processes. The alchemical laboratory was a projection of the psyche, and the substances and operations described in alchemical texts were symbols for psychological and spiritual realities. When alchemists spoke of purifying base metals, they were describing the purification of consciousness. When they described the marriage of opposites, they were symbolizing the integration of conscious and unconscious, masculine and feminine, spirit and matter. Jung discovered that the stages of alchemical work corresponded precisely to the stages of individuation. The nigartero or blackening was the encounter with the shadow. the descent into darkness and depression when consciousness confronted its own rejected contents. The albedo, or whitening, represented the emergence of clarity and purity after the shadow work, the integration of what had been split off. The rubedo, or reddening, represented the final stage of transformation, when opposites were united and wholeness was achieved. These were not arbitrary symbols, but natural expressions of how psychological transformation actually proceeded. The alchemical procedures described in text that seemed like chemical recipes were actually symbolic descriptions of psychological operations. Solutio, the dissolution of solid substances in liquid, represented the dissolution of rigid conscious attitudes through immersion in the unconscious. Calcinatio, the burning or heating of substances, represented the purification through suffering and sacrifice of ego attachments. Sublimatio, the transformation of solid into vapour, represented the spiritualization of consciousness, the transcendence of purely material and instinctual concerns. Coagulatio, the opposite of solutio, represented the grounding and embodiment of spiritual insights in concrete life. The goal of alchemy was described as the philosopher's stone, the miraculous substance that could transform anything it touched and grant eternal life. Jung recognized this as a symbol of the self, the archetype of wholeness that was simultaneously the goal and the origin of transformation. The stone was described in paradoxical terms that could not refer to any physical substance, but perfectly described the self. It was said to be everywhere and nowhere, the most valuable and the most worthless, hidden in plain sight, rejected by the many but sought by the few. These paradoxes captured the nature of the self as both the most obvious and the most hidden reality of human existence. The conjunctio, or sacred marriage, was perhaps the most important alchemical symbol. It represented the union of opposites, particularly the union of masculine and feminine, of Sol and Luna, of king and queen. Alchemical texts contained elaborate illustrations of this union, showing the male and female figures joining in various ways, sometimes in sexual embrace, sometimes as hermaphroditic beings combining both sexes, sometimes as a single being with two heads. Jung understood these images as representations of the integration of Anima and Animus, the union of conscious and unconscious, the reconciliation of opposite aspects of personality into a higher synthesis. The alchemical text often described the work as requiring patience and persistence over many years or even decades. This temporal dimension corresponded to Jung's understanding that individuation was not a quick process but the work of a lifetime. The alchemist spoke of repeated operations of circulation and distillation performed again and again. This matched Jung's observation that psychological integration required working through the same issues at deeper and deeper levels, that each apparent achievement revealed new layers requiring further work. Jung found in alchemy a complete symbolic language for expressing psychological and spiritual transformation that surpassed anything in modern psychology or conventional religion. The alchemists had developed sophisticated ways of representing relationships between consciousness and unconscious, ways of describing the stages of transformation, ways of depicting the goal of wholeness that honoured its paradoxical nature. They had done this through actual work with physical substances, allowing the unconscious to express itself through projection onto chemical operations. The result was a body of symbolic knowledge that had been preserved despite being misunderstood for centuries. The religious dimension of alchemy was particularly important for Jung's understanding. Many alchemists saw their work as parallel to or completing the work of Christianity. They spoke of the stone in Christ-like terms as a saviour and redeemer. They described their opus as creating the divine in matter, as bringing heaven to earth. But they also criticised conventional Christianity for being too spiritual and not sufficiently grounded in nature and the body. Alchemy represented an attempt to heal the split between spirit and matter that characterised Western religion, to find the divine within material creation rather than only in transcendent heaven. Jung spent years studying alchemical texts and writing extensive commentaries on their psychological meaning. His major works on alchemy, including Psychology and Alchemy and Mysterium Conjunctionis, were dense and difficult books that required readers to follow complex symbolic analyses and to understand both psychological and alchemical frameworks. These were not popular works but profound scholarly achievements that demonstrated the depth and sophistication of symbolic thinking that modern consciousness had lost. The parallels between alchemy and other symbolic systems further confirmed Jung's understanding of the collective unconscious and archetypal patterns. The stages of alchemical transformation appeared in different form in the stages of spiritual development described in various mystical traditions. The symbolism of death and rebirth appeared in alchemy as it did in initiation rituals from cultures around the world. The union of opposites was central to alchemy as it was to Tantra, to Taoism, to Christian mysticism, to Kabbalistic teaching. These similarities could not be explained by cultural transmission because they appeared in traditions that had no contact with each other. They emerged from the collective unconscious as natural expressions of how psychological transformation actually occurred. The discovery of alchemy gave Jung a historical grounding for his psychology that strengthened its claim to be more than merely one man's subjective system. The alchemists had been mapping the same psychological territories that Jung had discovered through his own inner work and clinical observation. They had developed a symbolic language for describing these territories that was in many ways richer and more precise than the conceptual language of modern psychology. By recovering and translating this language, Jung was not inventing a new psychology, but rediscovering ancient wisdom that modernity had forgotten. But Jung also recognized dangers in the alchemical path, both historically and psychologically. The alchemists themselves had often become inflated, identifying with the archetypal energies they were working with, and believing themselves to possess supernatural powers. They had become lost in their symbolic systems and unable to function effectively in ordinary reality. They had sometimes descended into psychosis when they opened themselves to the unconscious, without adequate ego strength to maintain boundaries. These dangers remained present for anyone who worked with the unconscious in depth, and Jung's warnings about inflation and possession applied as much to his own students as they had to the medieval alchemists. The practical application of alchemical symbolism for contemporary psychological work was subtle and required careful understanding. Jung did not recommend that people literally study alchemy or try to recreate alchemical operations. What mattered was recognizing the archetypal patterns that alchemy expressed and learning to perceive these patterns in one's own psychological process. When you experienced depression and darkness, you could understand it as nigrido rather than simply as pathology requiring elimination. When you encountered conflicts between opposite tendencies in yourself, you could recognize the need for conjunctio rather than trying to eliminate one side. When you experienced dissolution of familiar structures, you could trust this as part of transformation rather than resisting it as catastrophe. The alchemical perspective also changed how one understood the relationship between psychological and spiritual transformation. They were not separate processes, but different ways of describing the same fundamental movement toward wholeness and integration. Whether you use psychological language of individuation or religious language of salvation, whether you spoke of achieving the self or union with God, you were pointing toward the same reality that could never be completely captured in any conceptual system. The symbols of alchemy honored this mystery better than literal rational language because they acknowledged their own symbolic nature and did not pretend to offer complete rational explanation of what transcended rational categories. In his final years, Jung saw alchemy as confirmation of his life's work and as a gift to future generations who would need symbolic languages for psychological and spiritual development. The modern world had abandoned myth and symbol in favour of literal rational discourse, but the needs that myth and symbol addressed had not disappeared. They had been driven underground where they operated unconsciously and often destructively. By recovering alchemical symbolism and showing its psychological meaning, Jung was offering modern people a way back to depths they had lost, a language for experiences that secular culture dismissed, but that remained central to complete human life. In 1913, Jung stood at the edge of an abyss. His professional relationship with Freud had ended in bitter mutual rejection. His position in the psychoanalytic community had become untenable. His academic career at the University of Zurich was compromised. His marriage was strained by his involvement with a former patient, Tony Wolff, who had become his close companion and collaborator. But these external crises were only symptoms of a deeper crisis that was beginning to engulf him. Jung was about to descend into territories of the psyche that few had explored and that threatened to destroy him, even as they offered the possibility of unprecedented discovery. The crisis began with disturbing visions and fantasies that invaded Jung's waking consciousness. He saw Europe covered with ice and blood, catastrophic floods destroying civilization, massive destruction on a scale he could hardly comprehend. These visions terrified him because they seemed to indicate that he was losing his grip on reality, that he was descending into psychosis. When the First World War broke out in 1914, Jung experienced both relief and horror. Relief because the visions were not simply personal madness, but prescient intuitions of collective catastrophe. Horror because the reality was even worse than the visions had suggested. But the inner crisis deepened rather than resolved. Jung found himself overwhelmed by fantasies and inner experiences that had nothing to do with external events. He heard voices speaking to him from within. He encountered inner figures who seemed to possess independent reality and intelligence. He experienced himself as multiple rather than unified, as containing various subpersonalities or complexes that operated autonomously. He recorded elaborate conversations with these inner figures, particularly with an old man he called Philemon, who became a kind of inner teacher or guide. To any outside observer, including Jung himself at moments of clarity, this appeared to be a psychotic break. The crucial difference between Jung's experience and actual psychosis was that he maintained a thread of conscious awareness throughout the ordeal. He observed what was happening to him with the trained eye of a psychiatrist studying a fascinating case. He kept detailed records of his inner experiences, writing them down and painting images that emerged from the unconscious. He continued to function professionally, seeing patients and maintaining his practice even as his inner world was in chaos. He established rules for his engagement with the unconscious, setting specific times for inner work, and then returning to ordinary life and responsibilities. This discipline and conscious awareness allowed him to navigate the dangerous territories without being permanently overwhelmed or lost. What Jung was doing, though he only understood this fully in retrospect, was experimenting on himself with the technique he would later call active imagination. Instead of passively experiencing fantasies and visions, he engaged them actively while maintaining conscious awareness. He would quiet his rational mind and allow images to arise spontaneously. Then he would interact with these images as if they were independent beings with whom he could have genuine dialogue. He would ask them questions and allow answers to emerge that often surprised and challenged his conscious assumptions. He would follow where the images led, descending into depths and ascending to heights that ordinary consciousness could never access. The figures Jung encountered in this inner work became increasingly distinct and consistent. Philemon appeared as an old man with horns and the wings of a kingfisher, possessing wisdom that seemed to come from a source beyond Jung's personal knowledge. A female figure appeared whom Jung eventually identified as his Anima, representing the feminine dimension of his psyche. Various shadow figures appeared who embodied qualities Jung had rejected in himself. Divine child figures appeared who symbolized new possibilities of consciousness. These figures were not merely products of Jung's imagination, but autonomous contents of the collective unconscious that had their own reality and purposes. The most important insight from this period was Jung's recognition that the psyche contained levels and dimensions that consciousness could barely perceive. The ego, which seemed to be the whole of personality from the conscious perspective, was actually only a small part of a much larger totality. Beneath and surrounding consciousness lay the vast realm of the unconscious, and within that realm operated autonomous complexes and archetypal figures that possessed their own energy and intelligence. The individual psyche was not a closed system, but opened into the collective unconscious, connecting each person to universal patterns and images that transcended personal history. Jung also discovered during this period what he would later call the self, the organizing center of the entire psyche that directed development toward wholeness and integration. This was not the ego, but something greater that encompassed both consciousness and unconsciousness. The self manifested through the spontaneous production of mandala images that Jung found himself painting. These circular patterns, with their characteristic fourfold symmetry, appeared without conscious planning and seemed to represent the psyche's natural drive toward balance and completeness. The self was both the goal of development and its hidden director, working behind the scenes to guide consciousness toward its own realization. The danger of this work was real and not to be underestimated. Jung knew that he was walking a narrow path between creative exploration of the unconscious and psychotic dissolution. The difference lay in maintaining the integrity of ego consciousness, even while opening to contents that threatened to overwhelm it. Many people who descended into these depths did not return or return damaged and broken. The shamans of traditional cultures underwent similar ordeals, but within carefully structured ritual and communal frameworks that provided support and containment. Jung was working alone without such frameworks, creating his own methods through trial and error. The Red Book, which Jung created during this period but did not publish during his lifetime, stands as a monument to this inner journey. In this large volume, Jung recorded his visions and conversations with inner figures in elaborate calligraphy, and illuminated the text with paintings of the images he encountered. The Red Book resembles medieval illuminated manuscripts more than modern psychological writing. It is a work of art as much as a psychological document, expressing in visual and poetic language what could not be captured in ordinary conceptual discourse. The book remained hidden in Jung's family vault for decades after his death, only published in 2009 when it revealed dimensions of Jung's work that had been largely unknown. Jung emerged from this crisis transformed. He had descended into potential madness and returned with new understanding of the psyche's structure and dynamics. He had encountered directly the archetypal dimension of the collective unconscious. He had developed techniques for engaging the unconscious that would become central to his therapeutic work. He had verified through his own experience the reality of psychological and spiritual transformation that he would spend the rest of his life studying and describing. The man who came out of this ordeal was no longer merely a psychiatrist applying theoretical concepts, but a guide who had travelled into the underworld and returned with living knowledge. But Jung also recognised that his experience could not be universalised or prescribed for others without modification. Not everyone had the psychological strength to undertake such a radical exploration of the unconscious. Not everyone needed to go as deep as Jung had gone. The confrontation with the unconscious had to be calibrated to the individual's capacity and circumstances. For some people, attending to dreams and doing modest inner work was sufficient. For others, more intensive engagement through active imagination or depth analysis might be appropriate. But always there had to be adequate ego strength to maintain consciousness and prevent possession by unconscious contents. The relationship between consciousness and unconsciousness that Jung discovered through this ordeal became central to his entire psychological system. The unconscious was not merely a repository of repressed memories, but a creative source of new possibilities, a realm where healing and transformation occurred, a dimension that connected individual psyche to something vastly larger. Consciousness needed the unconscious just as much as the unconscious needed consciousness. The goal was not for consciousness to control or eliminate the unconscious, but for the two to develop a dynamic relationship of mutual influence and cooperation. This relationship was what Jung meant by the transcendent function, the capacity of the psyche to unite opposites and move toward wholeness. The years of confrontation with the unconscious taught Jung that psychological development was not primarily an intellectual process, but a lived experience that required courage, honesty, and willingness to face what one had been avoiding. Reading books about psychology or understanding concepts intellectually was not enough. One had to actually descend into one's own depths, encounter one's own shadow, dialogue with one's own inner figures, face one's own darkness and light. This experiential dimension made Jung's psychology more demanding than purely academic approaches, but also more transformative for those willing to undertake the work. In retrospect, Jung understood this period as his own individuation crisis, the necessary passage through chaos and dissolution that preceded the achievement of greater wholeness and integration. What appeared at the time as potential catastrophe was actually the necessary process through which the psyche transformed itself. This suffering and confusion were not obstacles to development, but the very means through which development occurred. This insight would shape Jung's approach to his patients' crises and symptoms. Instead of seeing psychological disturbance as pure pathology to be eliminated as quickly as possible, he learned to see it as potentially meaningful, as the psyche's way of forcing necessary transformation that consciousness would not undertake voluntarily. The confrontation with the unconscious was Jung's most important credential as a psychologist. It gave him authority that came not from academic training but from direct experience of the territories he was mapping. It allowed him to speak about the unconscious with conviction and precision that purely theoretical psychologists could never achieve. It gave him compassion for those who were struggling with their own psychological and spiritual crises because he had been through similar struggles himself. And it provided the experiential foundation for all the concepts and insights that would emerge in his later work, from the archetypes to the process of individuation, to the relationship between psychology and spirituality. Jung's encounter with Eastern philosophy and spiritual practice represented another crucial dimension of his lifelong effort to understand consciousness and its transformation. While he was developing his own psychology through clinical work and personal exploration of the unconscious, he discovered that ancient Eastern traditions had been mapping similar territories for thousands of years, using different symbolic languages and conceptual frameworks. This discovery both excited and troubled him. It excited him because it confirmed that his insights were not merely personal idiosyncrasies, but corresponded to universal patterns in human psychology and spirituality. It troubled him because he recognized that Western people could not simply adopt Eastern practices without profound misunderstanding and potential psychological danger. Jung's first significant encounter with Eastern thought came through his reading of Taoist texts, particularly the I Ching and writings attributed to Lao Tzu. He was struck by the Taoist understanding of reality as composed of complementary opposites that required balance rather than victory of one over the other. The yin-yang symbol perfectly captured what Jung had been discovering about the psyche, that consciousness and unconsciousness, masculine and feminine, thinking and feeling, needed to be held in dynamic tension rather than having one side dominate and repress the other. The Taoist concept of Wu Wei, action through non-action, resonated with Jung's understanding that genuine psychological transformation could not be forced through willpower, but required allowing unconscious processes to unfold naturally. Jung developed a sophisticated understanding of the I Ching that went beyond Western assumptions about divination and fortune-telling. He recognized that the I Ching operated on the principle of synchronicity, the meaningful correspondence between an inner psychological state and an external configuration of coins or yarrow stalks. When properly used, the I Ching did not predict the future through supernatural means, but revealed the hidden quality of the present moment and the potential directions it contained. Jung wrote a famous introduction to Richard Wilhelm's German translation of the I Ching, introducing Western readers to a symbolic system that expressed truths about change and transformation that complemented and enriched Western psychological understanding. His encounter with Buddhist philosophy, particularly Tibetan Buddhism and Zen, raised more complex questions. Jung recognized profound parallels between Buddhist meditation practices and his own technique of active imagination. Both involved quieting the rational mind and observing what arose from deeper levels of consciousness. Both required developing a witnessing awareness that could observe mental contents without identifying with them or being swept away by them. Both aimed at a transformation of consciousness that transcended ordinary ego awareness. But Jung also saw crucial differences between Buddhist goals and his own psychological approach. The Buddhist ideal of anatta, or no self, the realization that the ego was an illusion to be transcended, seemed to Jung to be fundamentally different from the Western psychological task of ego development. Western people, Jung observed, generally suffered from too little ego rather than too much. They were not strongly individuated, but were lost in collective identifications and persona. For such people, the Buddhist dissolution of ego could be psychologically dangerous, increasing their weakness and unconsciousness, rather than leading to enlightenment. What Westerners needed was not to dissolve the ego before it was properly formed, but to develop a strong conscious identity that could then, in the second half of life, be relativized and integrated into a larger sense of self. Jung travelled to India in 1937 and had direct encounters with Hindu philosophy and yogic practices. He visited sacred sites and met with spiritual teachers who embodied the wisdom of ancient traditions. But the trip confirmed his sense that Western people could not simply transplant Eastern practices without profound misunderstanding. He observed Western seekers in India who were trying to become Hindu or Buddhist, but who seemed to him to be escapists, avoiding their own psychological and cultural shadows rather than genuine spiritual practitioners. They were using Eastern spirituality as a defense against their own unconscious, rather than as a path toward integration. The fundamental difference Jung identified was that Eastern spirituality aimed at dissolution of ego and transcendence of the world, while Western psychology needed to aim at individuation and transformation within the world. The Eastern goal was often described as escape from the cycle of rebirth, liberation from the suffering inherent in material existence, realization of consciousness as ultimately separate from body and world. But Jung believed that Western people needed to embrace rather than escape their embodiment, to find meaning within time rather than only in eternity, to transform matter rather than simply transcend it. This difference reflected deeper historical and cultural patterns. Eastern civilizations had developed highly sophisticated practices of introversion, of turning consciousness inward to explore subtle dimensions of mind and spirit. But they had often neglected extraversion, the development of external civilization and mastery of material world. Western civilization had done the opposite, developing unprecedented capacity for external action and material manipulation while neglecting introversion and spiritual development. Neither pattern was complete or ideal. Each needed to learn from the other without abandoning its own fundamental orientation. Jung saw that the meeting between East and West in the modern period created both opportunities and dangers. The opportunity was for a genuine synthesis that would combine Western capacity for conscious development and individual differentiation with Eastern wisdom about the unconscious and the transpersonal dimensions of consciousness. Such a synthesis could produce a more complete humanity than either tradition alone could achieve. But the danger was that Westerners would simply appropriate superficial aspects of Eastern teaching without understanding their deeper meanings or recognizing the psychological work necessary for genuine integration. The mandala was a symbol that appeared prominently in both Eastern religious art and in the spontaneous productions of Jung's patients who had never been exposed to Eastern symbolism. This cross-cultural appearance confirmed for Jung that the mandala was an archetypal image emerging from the collective unconscious, rather than a culturally specific invention. But Jung also noted that Eastern mandalas were often products of conscious religious art following traditional patterns, while the mandalas that appeared in Western dreams and active imagination were usually spontaneous and unique expressions of individual psychological process. This difference reflected the different relationships to consciousness and unconsciousness in the two traditions. Jung's approach to yoga and meditation was similarly complex and nuanced. He recognized that these practices could be valuable for Westerners if properly understood and adapted, but he warned against mechanical imitation of Eastern techniques without understanding their psychological implications. Meditation practices that worked for people raised in Eastern cultures with different psychological structures might not work, or might even be harmful for Westerners. What was needed was not simply importing Eastern practices, but developing Western forms of inner work that achieved similar goals through methods appropriate to Western psychological structures. The concept of the self in Jung's psychology showed both parallels and differences with Eastern concepts like Atman in Hinduism or Buddha nature in Buddhism. All three pointed toward a dimension of consciousness that transcended the personal ego and connected the individual to something universal and eternal. But Jung was careful to maintain the distinction between self and ego, while some Eastern teachings seemed to him to collapse this distinction too completely. The self was not simply the dissolution of ego, but its transformation and integration into a larger totality. The ego remained as a functioning center of consciousness even when it recognized itself as part of a greater whole. Jung's interest in Eastern alchemy, particularly Taoist alchemical texts, revealed further parallels between his psychology and Eastern wisdom. Chinese alchemy, like Western alchemy, used the language of material transformation to describe spiritual and psychological processes. The goal of creating an immortal, subtle body corresponded to what Jung called the realization of the self. The practices of circulating energy through meditation corresponded to what Jung understood as establishing relationship between consciousness and unconsciousness. These parallels suggested that the human psyche followed similar patterns of development across cultures, even when different symbolic languages were used to describe them. But Jung insisted that Westerners needed to find their own path to individuation that grew from their own cultural and psychological soil. Simply adopting Eastern practices was a form of psychic colonization in reverse that betrayed authentic psychological development. What was needed was to honor the wisdom of Eastern traditions while also honoring the unique psychological and spiritual tasks facing Western people. This required creative synthesis rather than mere imitation, genuine dialogue between traditions rather than wholesale adoption of foreign ways. In his final understanding, Jung saw Eastern wisdom and Western psychology as complementary approaches to the mystery of human consciousness and its potential transformation. Neither was complete without the other. Eastern teachings offered profound insights about the transpersonal dimensions of consciousness and sophisticated practices for working with subtle psychological and spiritual energies. Western psychology offered understanding of the ego's development and the process of individual differentiation that Eastern traditions often neglected. The meeting between these traditions was one of the most important developments of the modern period, promising a more complete understanding of consciousness than either tradition alone could provide. In the final decades of his life, Jung became increasingly concerned with the collective destiny of humanity and the psychological forces that would shape civilization's future. He had witnessed 2 world wars, the rise and fall of totalitarian movements, the Holocaust, and the development of nuclear weapons that threatened human extinction. These catastrophes confirmed his darkest predictions about what happened when collective consciousness lost its connection to deeper sources of meaning and wisdom. But Jung remained neither optimist nor pessimist about humanity's prospects. He understood that the future depended on whether enough individuals could undertake the difficult work of psychological integration and whether civilization could recover dimensions of consciousness that modernity had rejected. Jung recognized that the fundamental crisis facing modern humanity was psychological and spiritual rather than primarily political or economic. The external problems that dominated public attention, wars and economic instability, and environmental destruction, were symptoms of deeper disorders in consciousness itself. Modern people had become radically one-sided, developing certain capacities to unprecedented levels while allowing other essential dimensions of human nature to atrophy or operate unconsciously. This imbalance created a collective shadow of enormous power that periodically erupted in catastrophic violence and irrationality. Until the underlying psychological problems were addressed, no amount of political reform or technological innovation could create genuine peace or lasting solutions. The danger of mass movements and collective psychosis had been demonstrated with horrifying clarity by fascism and communism. Jung understood that these movements represented possessions by archetypal energies that overwhelmed rational consciousness. When people lost individual identity and merged into the collective, they became capable of atrocities that they would never commit as individuals. The crowd possessed its own psychology that was fundamentally different from individual psychology. In the crowd, conscience dissolved, rational judgment disappeared, and primitive instincts gained free expression. The individual became a cell in a larger organism that operated according to different principles than conscious individual choice. Jung warned that mass movements would continue to threaten civilization because these psychological conditions that produced them had not fundamentally changed. Modern people remained starved for meaning and community. They remained unconscious of their own shadows and therefore vulnerable to projection. They remained disconnected from archetypal sources of transcendent significance and therefore susceptible to political ideologies that promised to fill this void. The forms that mass movements took might change, but the underlying psychological dynamics would remain constant until individuals became more conscious and more psychologically integrated. The development of nuclear weapons represented for Jung an external symbol of an internal psychological reality. Humanity had developed the capacity to destroy itself completely, to end not only civilization but life itself on Earth. This unprecedented power reflected the dangerous conjunction of advanced technology with psychological and moral immaturity. Human beings possessed godlike capacities for creation and destruction, but remained psychologically infantile, driven by unconscious forces they did not understand and could not control. Unless psychological development caught up with technological development, the result would inevitably be catastrophe. But Jung also saw in the nuclear threat a potential catalyst for transformation. The recognition that human survival was at stake might force a level of consciousness that nothing else could produce. People might finally be motivated to undertake the difficult inner work that they had been avoiding. The external threat might create psychological conditions in which genuine transformation became possible. The apocalyptic possibility was also an opportunity for unprecedented psychological and spiritual development if humanity could respond consciously rather than remaining trapped in unconscious patterns. Jung believed that the transformation of civilization could only come through the transformation of individuals. This was not a political program, but a psychological necessity. Collective problems could not be solved at the collective level because collective action always remained vulnerable to possession by unconscious forces. But individuals who had integrated their shadows, who had established conscious relationships with their unconscious, who had undertaken the journey toward wholeness, could contribute something genuinely new to collective life. They could resist mass movements and collective delusions. They could bring truly individual perspectives rather than merely repeating collective attitudes. They could serve as points of light in the darkness, not saving the world through heroic action but maintaining consciousness in the face of collective unconsciousness. The role of individuals in collective transformation was paradoxical. On one hand, individual development seemed to move away from collective concerns toward inner work and personal transformation. On the other hand, genuinely individuated people were the only ones who could serve collective needs without being swallowed by collective unconsciousness. Someone who had not differentiated themselves from the collective could only act as a vehicle for collective forces, but someone who had achieved genuine individuality could bring something new into collective life precisely because they had separated themselves from collective identifications. Jung understood that this vision would seem elitist or escapist to many people. How could focusing on individual psychological development address urgent social and political problems? How could inner work help when the world was burning and millions were suffering? But Jung insisted that the apparently more direct approaches to social transformation were actually less effective because they remained trapped in unconscious patterns. Revolutionary movements that promised to solve all problems through political action became possessed by the very forces they claimed to oppose. Reform efforts that did not address underlying psychological issues produced only superficial changes that left fundamental problems untouched. The relationship between psychological development and spiritual awakening became increasingly central to Jung's vision in his final years. He recognized that what he was describing as individuation was essentially the same process that religious traditions had called by various names: salvation, enlightenment, union with God, realization of one's true nature. The difference was that Jung approached this transformation psychologically, describing it in terms that did not require belief in specific metaphysical doctrines. But the goal was the same: the transformation of consciousness from identification with ego to recognition of participation in something vastly larger. Jung saw evidence in his own clinical work and in his study of cultural history that consciousness was evolving, that human beings were gradually becoming more aware of the unconscious dimensions of psyche. The discovery of the unconscious itself was a historical development, a new capacity for self-reflection and psychological observation. The emergence of depth psychology represented evolution in human consciousness, the development of new tools for self-understanding and transformation. This evolution was slow and uneven, affecting only a small percentage of the population initially. But Jung believed it represented a real historical development that would gradually spread and potentially transform human civilization. The role of symbols and symbolic consciousness in future development was crucial to Jung's vision. Modern civilization had largely abandoned symbolic thinking in favor of literal rational discourse. But the loss of symbols meant loss of connection to archetypal dimensions of experience that could only be expressed symbolically. Religion had provided symbolic frameworks for thousands of years, but conventional religion was dying in the modern world. What was needed was recovery of symbolic consciousness in new forms appropriate to modern understanding. Psychology itself could serve this function, providing symbolic languages for describing transformation without requiring literal belief in outdated cosmologies. Jung also recognized the importance of what he called the integration of the feminine for future collective development. Western civilization had been dominated by masculine consciousness, with its emphasis on logos, rationality, analysis, conquest, and control. The feminine principle of eros, relationship, feeling, receptivity, and connection to nature had been systematically devalued and repressed. This one-sidedness had produced tremendous achievements in certain areas, but had also created profound imbalances that threatened civilization's survival. The recovery and integration of feminine consciousness was essential for achieving the balance necessary for continued human flourishing. The ecological crisis, which was just beginning to be recognized in Jung's final years, represented another dimension of the collective shadow and another symptom of psychological one-sidedness. The technological domination of nature reflected the same consciousness that had dominated and repressed the unconscious, the body, the feminine, and indigenous peoples. The fantasy of complete mastery and control, whether over nature or over the psyche, was a masculine inflation that denied the reality of participation in larger wholes beyond conscious control. Genuine ecological consciousness required psychological transformation, recognition that human beings were part of nature rather than separate from it, participants in processes larger than themselves rather than autonomous masters. Jung's vision for humanity's future was neither utopian nor despairing, but realistic and conditional. He did not believe that humanity would inevitably progress toward enlightenment, or that catastrophe could be avoided through technological solutions alone. The future depended on choices that individuals and collectives would make, on whether enough people could achieve sufficient consciousness to tip the balance away from destruction and toward transformation. This consciousness could not be imposed from outside, but had to be achieved through individual inner work that gradually accumulated and influenced collective consciousness. The image of the wounded healer captured Jung's understanding of how transformation occurred. Those who had suffered deeply and had worked through their suffering without being destroyed by it possessed wisdom and compassion that could help others. The healer was not someone who had transcended suffering, but someone who had been transformed by it. This applied both to individual therapy and to collective transformation. Civilizations that acknowledged their own wounds and shadows rather than projecting them onto others could develop genuine wisdom. Nations that faced their own dark histories rather than maintaining fantasies of innocence could contribute to collective healing rather than perpetuating cycles of violence. In his final works and interviews, Jung spoke with increasing urgency about the necessity of psychological and spiritual work. He felt that time was running out, that humanity was approaching a crisis point where the consequences of collective unconsciousness would become catastrophic and irreversible. But he also maintained hope that individuals who did genuine inner work could make a difference, that consciousness was cumulative, and that each person who achieved greater integration contributed to collective consciousness in ways that could not be measured or immediately perceived. This was not a comfortable or heroic vision, but it was honest, acknowledging both the magnitude of the crisis and the reality of possibility for transformation. Jung's final message to humanity was both simple and profound. Become conscious. Face your shadow. Integrate what you have rejected. Establish relationship with your unconscious. Recognize your participation in something larger than yourself. Do not project your darkness onto others, but acknowledge it in yourself. Do not seek collective solutions that avoid individual responsibility. Do not look for external saviors, but undertake the difficult work of psychological and spiritual development. This path was narrow and difficult. Few would choose it, but it was the only path that led toward genuine transformation of consciousness and genuine hope for humanity's future. As we reach the end of this long journey through Carl Jung's psychology, we return to where we began, to the fundamental insight that animated his entire life's work. Human beings are not complete as they ordinarily exist. We are divided against ourselves, conscious and unconscious at war, identified with one-sided personas while vast dimensions of our nature remain unknown and unlived. We suffer from this incompleteness, even when we do not understand its source. We search for wholeness through countless substitutes, through achievement and relationship and pleasure and power, never quite finding what we seek because we are looking in the wrong places. The quest for wholeness is the deepest human motivation, the driving force behind all psychological development, the hidden meaning of every individual life. Jung understood that this quest was not optional or reserved for especially spiritual people. Every human being was engaged in this journey whether they recognized it or not. The question was not whether to pursue wholeness, but whether to pursue it consciously or unconsciously, whether to cooperate with the self's purposes or to resist them, whether to accept the difficult work of integration or to remain fragmented and one-sided. The unconscious pursuit of wholeness produced symptoms, crises, suffering that forced attention to neglected dimensions of personality. The conscious pursuit produced genuine transformation, the gradual achievement of psychological and spiritual maturity. The process of individuation that Jung described was both universal and utterly individual. It followed certain typical patterns that appeared across cultures and throughout history. The stages of separation from collective identifications, confrontation with the shadow, encounter with contrasexual dimensions, approach to the self, were recognizable in myths and in individual lives. But the specific content of each person's journey was unique, shaped by their particular nature and circumstances. No one else could walk your path or tell you exactly what your individuation required. You had to discover it through attention to dreams, through honest self-examination, through willingness to follow where the self led, even when the direction seemed strange or frightening. Jung recognized that individuation was not a process that could be completed in a single lifetime. The goal of wholeness was both achievable and forever beyond reach. You could achieve significant integration, could become far more conscious and complete than you began, could realize dimensions of potential that remained dormant in most people. But you could never achieve absolute wholeness because consciousness could never completely encompass the unconscious, because the self transcended ego's capacity for comprehension, because new dimensions of personality always remain to be discovered and integrated. The process was infinite, extending beyond death into realms that psychology could not map with certainty. The relationship between individuation and death was profound and mysterious. Jung observed that people who had done genuine psychological work approached death very differently from those who remained identified with ego consciousness. Those who had touched the self experienced themselves as participating in something that transcended individual existence. Death was not absolute ending, but transformation, the final stage of a process that had been unfolding throughout life. Their dreams in the final years often contained symbols of the self, and images of wholeness that suggested the psyche's natural preparation for this ultimate transition. But Jung was careful not to make metaphysical claims about survival after death, or to promise immortality as a reward for psychological work. He spoke only of what he could observe psychologically, the transformation in how people related to death when they had achieved deeper consciousness. Whether the self survived bodily death or whether it represented only the deepest dimension of psyche that perished with the body, Jung considered unknowable. What mattered psychologically was that individuation changed the meaning of death from absurd termination to meaningful completion of a developmental process. The legacy that Jung left was both a systematic psychology and something harder to define, a way of being in relationship to the mystery of existence. His concepts and techniques, the archetypes and the typology, and the methods of dream analysis and active imagination provided practical tools for psychological work. But underneath all the concepts was a fundamental attitude toward life that honored consciousness while acknowledging its limitations, that valued rational understanding while recognizing dimensions of reality that transcended reason, that sought personal development while remaining aware of participation in larger wholes. This attitude included profound respect for the unconscious as an autonomous reality with its own intelligence and purposes. Jung did not see the unconscious as something to be controlled or eliminated, but as a partner in dialogue, a source of wisdom that complemented conscious understanding. He recognized that consciousness emerged from the unconscious and remained dependent on it, that the ego was a relatively recent development in evolution and remained fragile and limited. Honoring the unconscious meant attending to dreams, respecting intuitions and feelings that arose from depths, being willing to have one's conscious plans and preferences overruled by something wiser operating beneath awareness. The attitude also included humility about the limits of human knowledge and control. Jung had seen too much of the unconscious's power and mystery to believe that psychology could ever achieve complete understanding or mastery. There would always be dimensions of psyche that remained unknown, forces operating in ways that exceeded rational comprehension, experiences that could be lived but never fully explained. This humility was not weakness but wisdom, recognition that consciousness existed within a larger context of mystery that demanded respect rather than the arrogance of believing that science or reason could eventually explain everything. But Jung's attitude also included trust in the process of transformation, faith that the psyche possessed inherent healing capacities and developmental directions. When consciousness cooperated with unconscious purposes rather than fighting against them, remarkable transformations became possible. symptoms that seemed purely pathological could reveal themselves as meaningful attempts by the psyche to force necessary development. Crises that appeared catastrophic could become opportunities for breakthrough to new levels of integration. The suffering that seemed meaningless could prove to be the very means through which consciousness expanded and deepened. This trust was not naive optimism or denial of life's genuine tragedies and losses. Jung had witnessed too much suffering and had experienced too much himself to maintain illusions about life's difficulties. But he had also witnessed transformation emerging from suffering, meaning emerging from chaos, renewal emerging from breakdown. He had seen that the human psyche was resilient and creative, beyond what rational consciousness could imagine. He had experienced that when you surrendered ego's need for control and opened to deeper guidance, you often received help from unexpected sources within, and sometimes, apparently from without. The practical application of Jung's psychology in contemporary life remained as relevant and necessary as when he first articulated his insights. Modern people continued to suffer from the same fundamental problems Jung identified: loss of meaning, disconnection from unconscious sources of vitality and wisdom, one-sided identification with persona and social roles, unconscious projection of shadow onto others, failure to integrate contrasexual dimensions, inability to face mortality with acceptance and peace. The forms these problems took might change with cultural and technological developments, but the underlying psychological dynamics remained constant because they reflected the structure of the human psyche itself. The tools Jung developed for addressing these problems remained powerful and effective when properly understood and applied. Attention to dreams provided direct access to unconscious perspectives that complemented and corrected one-sided conscious attitudes. Active imagination allowed dialogue with autonomous contents of psyche and integration of what had been split off. Shadow work through honest self-examination revealed projections and enabled withdrawal of darkness from others back into oneself where it could be transformed. Analysis of psychological type revealed one-sidedness and pointed toward neglected functions needing development. Study of myth and symbol connected individual experience to universal patterns and provided languages for expressing what could not be captured in literal rational discourse. But Jung always emphasized that techniques and concepts were only aids to a process that ultimately transcended method. Individuation could not be achieved mechanically by following prescribed steps or completing exercises. It required genuine engagement with one's own unique psychological reality, willingness to face what emerged from the unconscious, even when it contradicted ego preferences, courage to follow an individual path, even when it diverged from collective norms and expectations. The analyst or therapist could accompany and guide, but could not do the work for another person. Each individual had to undertake their own journey and make their own discoveries. The vision of humanity that emerges from Jung's psychology is both humbling and elevating. We are not the rational, autonomous agents that Enlightenment philosophy proclaimed us to be. We are participants in processes that vastly exceed our conscious understanding and control, shaped by forces from personal history and from collective evolutionary development, possessed by archetypes that operate through us whether we acknowledge them or not. Our consciousness is a small island in an ocean of unconsciousness, our ego a fragile construct that can be overwhelmed in an instant by forces from within or without. But we are also capable of remarkable development and transformation. We can become conscious of what was unconscious, integrating shadow and expanding awareness. We can establish relationship with the depths of psyche and receive guidance from sources beyond rational calculation. We can individuate, becoming more completely ourselves rather than remaining identified with collective patterns and persona. We can touch the self and experience directly the sacred dimensions of existence. We can transform suffering into wisdom and darkness into light. We can achieve wholeness that honors all dimensions of human nature rather than remaining one-sided and incomplete. This is Jung's ultimate gift to humanity, a map of the territory of the soul, a psychology that does justice to the full complexity and mystery of human existence, a path toward transformation that integrates rather than rejects dimensions of reality that materialist science dismisses. His work remains unfinished and will always remain unfinished, because the exploration of consciousness is infinite. Each generation must discover anew what Jung discovered, must make the journey into the unconscious in their own way, must confront their own shadows and integrate their own rejected dimensions. But Jung's maps and methods and insights provide invaluable guidance for those willing to undertake this journey. They offer language for experiences that secular culture dismisses as meaningless. They provide techniques for working with dreams and unconscious material that would otherwise remain inaccessible. They offer hope that transformation is possible even in the darkest circumstances. They point toward wholeness as both goal and ongoing process, both achievement and infinite aspiration. As you complete this journey through Jung's psychology, you stand at a threshold. You can return to ordinary life and consciousness, putting aside what you have heard as interesting but not personally relevant. Or you can begin your own journey of individuation, attending to your dreams, confronting your shadow, engaging your unconscious, following where the self leads. This choice cannot be made intellectually, but only through commitment and action. The knowledge you have gained is only valuable if it leads to lived experience and genuine transformation. The quest for wholeness is eternal because it is the deepest meaning of human existence. We are born incomplete and we die incomplete. But in the journey between birth and death, we can achieve remarkable development and integration. We can become more conscious, more complete, more fully human. We can touch the sacred dimensions of existence and experience directly that we participate in something vastly larger than our individual lives. We can suffer meaningfully rather than meaninglessly, love consciously rather than unconsciously, face death with acceptance rather than terror. This is the wisdom that Carl Jung spent his life discovering and sharing. This is the legacy he left to anyone willing to undertake the difficult but rewarding work of psychological and spiritual development. The path is narrow and few find it, but those who do discover treasures beyond measure. The journey is long and difficult, but those who persist find that the destination was always present in the beginning. That wholeness was always available beneath the layers of conditioning and unconsciousness, that the self was always calling even when the ego could not hear. Listen to your dreams, face your shadow, integrate what you have rejected, establish dialogue with your unconscious, follow where the self leads. This is the path Jung mapped. This is the journey each person must undertake in their own unique way. This is the quest for wholeness that gives meaning to human existence. The journey begins now, in this moment, with whatever awareness you can bring. The rest will unfold as you proceed, guided by forces wiser than ego, moving toward wholeness that transcends yet includes everything you are and have been and might become. The night deepens and the voice that has been guiding you through these territories of soul and psyche prepares to fall silent. But the silence that follows is not empty. It is filled with everything you have heard, with images and insights that will continue to work in your unconscious, long after conscious attention has moved elsewhere. This is how transformation occurs, not through dramatic conversion or sudden enlightenment, but through slow accumulation of awareness, through gradual integration of what was split off, through patient dialogue between consciousness and the depths. Carl Jung's life was itself a demonstration of the principles he discovered. He began as a conventional psychiatrist following established methods. He descended into chaos and potential madness. He emerged transformed with new understanding and new capacities. He spent decades developing and refining his insights through clinical work and scholarly research. He faced death having achieved remarkable wholeness, while recognizing that the journey continued beyond what consciousness could perceive. His life was not perfect or without failures and limitations, but it embodied genuine individuation. the journey from unconscious identification with collective patterns toward conscious realization of unique, individual nature and potential. You who have listened to this long exploration now possess knowledge that most people never encounter. You understand that the psyche has depths and dimensions that secular culture ignores. You recognize that consciousness emerges from and remains embedded in unconsciousness. You know about archetypes and shadow, about anima and animus, about the self as both center and circumference of psychological totality. You have been given maps of territories that you must now explore in your own experience if this knowledge is to become living wisdom rather than remaining abstract information. Sleep well, dream deeply, listen to what arises from the unconscious. The work continues in sleep as in waking, in darkness as in light. The self does not rest, does not cease its work of guiding consciousness toward wholeness. Trust the process even when you cannot understand it. Honor the mystery even while seeking understanding. Walk the path that only you can walk, finding your own way toward the wholeness that has always been your deepest nature and your ultimate destiny.